and all right. I hope you enjoy lunch, and we look forward to an afternoon of enriching and consequential discussions on the financial system and on the issue of debt and climate. Before we start the third session, we have a special message that is going to be read by Cardinal Peter Turkson, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Cardinal Turkson, the floor is yours.
So now, in view of your gathering here, we sought to ask for an audience with Pope Leo, or if he had time to just stop by here and say hello to everybody. Apparently, he's still trying to find his feet. He couldn't make the time, but he sent this small message to us. So first, we'd like you all to know that we try to have you have an audience with the Pope. Okay, so you be the first one to greet him from the academy. So this is his message through the Secretary of State. His Eminence Peter Turkson, Chancellor, etc., in the name of His Holiness, Pope Leo the 14th, I send greetings to Your Eminence and to all those gathered to discuss the topic of the debt and development crisis in the developing countries. In the light of the serious ongoing challenges which disproportionately impact those in the developing world, I'm grateful for your efforts to propose a framework for responding to them. While I would repeat the Jubilee Year appeal of the late Pope Francis for creditor nations to consider reducing substantially, if not canceling outright, the international debt that threatens the future of many countries, I encourage your work to propose other measures to address this issue. Such recommendations could be presented in a spirit of fraternal solidarity, highlighting and strengthening the ties that bind creditors and debtors alike to a shared destiny in this regard. I hope that the efforts of the Commission of Experts will contribute positively to the ongoing global discussion on debt relief and provide tangible and innovative options that offer mutual benefit, thus inviting a broader coalition of support from the international community. With these sentiments, I cordially invoke an abundance of divine blessings on all of you present. Signed, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State. So that's the message we got. If you want, we'll make copies for all of you to take along. There is another message which is not meant for this assembly, but I just share with you because as Professor Stiglitz said at the beginning, this academy has an older brother called the Academy of Sciences. And the president of that thought that science increasingly is coming under pressure from policymakers, governments, and all of that. So a week ago, he and his council got together to also do a small message, which is now published in the Nature magazine and a few other sites, protecting freedom of science and preventing distortion of scientific truth. So that's the title of this paper, which is now, if you're interested, we can also do copies of this for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cardinal Turkson, and we also thank Cardinal Parolin, and of course, the words from Pope Leo XIV. and we look forward to working together during the year of the Jubilee, based on what the Jubilee report basically says and the path forward that it provides. So let me begin. Oh, before we begin with session 3, we have one more message that I will ask Mahmoud Mohelden to read. So Mahmoud.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, and very pleased to hear this very strong message of support for our work from Pope Leo, and as reflected in the words recited to us by Cardinal Turkson. I have this message, as mentioned by Martin. That message is supposed to be delivered by Judge Muhammad Abdul Salam, the Secretary General of the High Committee of Human Fraternity and the Muslim Council of the Elders, on behalf of the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the Grand Sheikh Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayyib, who is expressing the following, that he has been very much supportive of this initiative from the very beginning, under the leadership of Pope Francis, and he feels that if operationalized well, it can only stand for the well-being of humanity at large. And he emphasized that Al-Azhar will not hesitate to provide every possible way to support this initiative for developing economies and for the countries suffering under the current severe global challenges. He emphasized as well that the continuity of the work through the offices of Pope Leo is very much encouraging. And again, he's instructed his team around the world to provide every possible support in the spirit of brotherhood for the humanity's sake and for the people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, so after this, two very special messages from Pope Leo and from the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, we will now focus on how to reimagine the international financial architecture. I'll ask the technical team to project the slides. I'll provide a very brief overview of what the report says in terms of the system. One that I don't think it will make justice to what has been included, but I don't want to be too long. At the end of the previous session, we had a brief discussion about the key asymmetries in the system. The developing countries generally have structures of production with low diversification. So external shocks hit them more badly than the way external shocks hit advanced economies. A country that is highly dependent on a few commodities suffers significantly when there is a change in the price of any of those commodities, obviously. So the first key asymmetry is an asymmetry of development. And ultimately, in order to resolve the problems of risk associated with developing economies, it's of utmost importance. It's absolutely critical to tackle the problems of the low diversification of the structures of production. When these economies integrate into the global economy, they are, of course, penalized by the higher risk, so they have to pay a higher risk premium. If that integration happens in a way in which the capital accounts are completely open, that additional cost of financing translates also to the cost of financing in local currency. Ideally, we want to build an international financial architecture in which there are capital flows from the advanced economies where capital is more abundant to the developing economies, and one in which the savings, the national savings in domestic economies, translate to investments in those economies rather than flying abroad and being saved in tax havens or financial accounts in the advanced world. And that's not how the system works. So understanding these key asymmetries is fundamental for for any path forward. The report goes then beyond actions to resolve the current crisis and focuses on actions to avoid and resolving that crisis in the future, and actions to improve the quality of finance, the quality of global finance. And there is a set of recommendations that address the issue of improving the quality of lending, focusing on the shared responsibility, the responsibility of the borrower and the responsibility of the lender. On the borrower side, there's discussion on what reforms could be adopted in terms of domestic legislation to provide for more accountability, transparency, sustainability of debt decisions, understanding that credit may be a powerful use for economic development. Debt is not necessarily bad. Actually, it should be good. Countries need to borrow in order to promote economic development. And when it comes to lending, we had a brief discussion in the second session, and we will go beyond that. We refer not only to private creditors, but also to the official creditors and the international financial institutions. When it comes to the IMF, there's a paragraph about the importance of even-handedness, treating different countries in the same conditions in the same way. That's very important. The report also focuses on how to address the fundamental dysfunctions in global financial markets, and given those dysfunctions, what can countries do to protect themselves? So it intends to revive the role of capital account regulations. What role macroprudential capital account regulations could play for discouraging hot money flows that are destabilizing, that create too much volatility of the real exchange rate, for which there is no insurance in the developing countries, and at the same time enable create an environment that is more enabling of investments in the real economy that promotes long-term development. Also, the report addresses the issue of debt contracts. How can debt contracts be improved to align debt payment capacity with scheduled debt payments, to improve the sustainability of those contracts? And finally, the most fundamental reform that was also discussed in the previous session is the issue of the framework, an international framework for the resolution of sovereign debts, and the challenges that the design of such framework in a world in which power matters and power determines governance entail. The issue of debt sustainability frameworks is not just important for addressing the current crisis, but for preventing crises and resolving them in the future, so it also gets a full section. And there are a number of specific proposals, some of them within the easier-to-do actions, referred to the policies of multilateral institutions, the IMF and the multilateral development banks, that, in the view of the Commission, could help to improve matters in the medium term. The report also proposes the creation of two funds for a better risk sharing, a global climate fund and a global fund to stabilize commodity prices. And I hope to have a discussion on this as well. And finally, it presents broader reforms to the multilateral development lending system. The concern of the Commission is that, given the lack of political will of the governments and parliaments from the advanced economies to provide more resources to the multilateral development banks, these banks end up relying too much on raising resources in the private global capital markets. And therefore, they get more scared of credit downgrades. And their models start to become closer to the models of commercial banks, which are more risk-averse. But development entails risk-taking, bold actions. So this evolution of global finance is to some extent undermining the role of the multilateral development banks, and we think this needs to be addressed. Of course, the optimal way of addressing this situation is with an increase in the contribution of the countries that are in a better position for that, which are the richer countries in the world. And also, we refer to the role that MDBs could play for harnessing the possibility of for basically promoting the lending in local currency. Countries should be able to lend more, to borrow more in local currency to avoid currency mismatches that create volatility that is detrimental for prosperity. Finally, and now this is the last slide, we focus on how to improve regional financing conditions and local financing conditions, also to promote local currency financing, and to foster debtor coordination and cooperation, a message that resonates and is consistent with the message of the UN expert group that Trevor Manuel, Mahmoud Mohelen, and others have developed. There is room for improvement within the debtor community, and also room for strengthening the South financial integration. That said, now let me move to discussion. We will have three lead discussants, two here in the room and one virtually. In the room, we'll have Marina Zucker-Marquez, who has done some of the best work in the field in the last few years, and it's also been a very important input for the work of the Commission. She is currently at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Marcus Rienemeyer, also a top global expert on macroeconomics and finance, who is a professor at Princeton University, and Mariana Mazzucato, who is today chairing the annual conference of the IIPP at the University of College London, the academic think tank she leads. She's a professor at the University of College London, and she's going to be joining us virtually and providing her intervention that way. So let me then begin with Marina Zucker-Marquez.
Thank you, Martin, and it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be here with this group. I think this report highlighted a key, discussion for developing countries and others. That is, when an economy actually needs to do a surgery. And in macroeconomic terms, let's say when a country needs to restructure, basically it's an economic surgery. As Professor Stiglitz mentioned, it's very complicated. And we know that those that have been in this situation know that even with, modern medicine, this is a process that is very complicated. And it's a very painful process. But what would be modern medicine in that restructuring for today? And this is maybe the report highlighted, gave a blueprint on this process. That is, it needs to be fast and needs to have deeper haircuts so countries don't need to go restructuring over and over again. We cannot impose the cost in the most vulnerable citizens, and also we need combined countercyclical finance. The problem is that when we see the case by case, what we see today, we are actually, in economic terms, we are applying the medieval medicine for developing countries. You do exactly the opposite on these cases. And I think a lot of when you talk about solidarity, we need to make this process for developing countries less painful. And I think this report highlights how. I could go on on the analogy, but I think I'll now talk a little bit on the post-surgery after countries, if we need a restructuring, what should be done? Not as we discussed, debt relief by itself is not a silver bullet, but it's part of the process. So what do we do after this? I think often the public discussion focuses on countries having too much debt. My concern going forward is that some countries, and this is highlighted because the next generation will maybe pay too much of a cost. My concern actually is that our generation and the next one is going to have too little debt. And we need to emphasize that we need better debt, we need more debt. Debt that is productive, that is cheaper. So we need to borrow for productive and good purpose. And this is a matter of social justice. I think that is an opportunity cost of not borrowing enough. And I'm glad that the report emphasized the good and the bad debt. But beyond the good and the bad debt, here I would like to discuss a little bit the debt that we have some agency as, experts, as civil society, and the debt that we don't have as much agency. So here I'm talking about the key role of multilateral development banks. Of course, the private sector needs to be part of the, more finance, more productive, so countries can grow. But the truth is that the private sector, they are profit-driven, and you can, mobilize them to some extent. The multilateral development banks is one where there is more agency and more role for experts, for civil society, to guide us the resources where it's needed most. So I think moving forward, not only the debt relief is an important conversation, but what is the new debt that needs to be here? And I think the report did a very good job highlighting this. So what will be the role of the multilateral development bank? I think that is now a huge conversation within the G20, within the COP. The MDBs, multilateral development banks, need to be bigger, they need to be better. And there are some numbers from the IHLAG and other groups highlighting the need to at least triple the volume of lending from multilateral development banks. And if short, and research that we did in Boston University highlight that if market interest rate is higher, actually we need even more volume. But we need to make the multilateral development banks less risky and be willing to actually invest where projects that are socially important. They need to be more concessional. They need to invest more on project preparation, pre-feasibility funds, because when we need countercyclical finance, there will be projects that actually countries can invest. We need more financial innovations, hybrid and others, but at top of this, we need more capitalization of these banks. And this is a conversation that we need to have with developed countries. A key other point that the report emphasizes is the collaboration, the South-South collaboration, and I think there is a lot of role here, what to do with non-legacy multilateral development banks. They also need to be a part of this. So this is in the part of the long-term product investments. We also need a better global financial safety net. As Martin mentioned, countries have different capacity to provide countercyclical capacity, and this needs to be compensated. So we need more regional financial arrangements, more swap lines, more, a better IMF to be providing countercyclical finance. And I know that is now, I just finalized that I know there is a lot of discussion now that advanced countries could not, capitalize banks or providing more concessional finance because there is this perceived fiscal pressure, which I'd like to emphasize that their fiscal pressure is completely different from developing countries, and they have much more leeway to actually lend and, do countercyclical finance. But even if it's true, let's say that they in fact have less space, fiscal space, we need, if you're talking about solidarity, I think we need to emphasize other non-fiscal measures. And I think we need to have a serious conversation not only about special drawing rights, new recurring special drawing rights, maybe from another institution, not only from the IMF, rechanneling. So I think it's welcoming the proposal from Spain and more innovative ideas on, we could rechannel SDRs for MDB. We should be, focusing more on get it done. But also the gold is a very good example. So there is over 250 billion in, gold in the IMF. We need to have a huge conversation how to boost this. We know it's politically challenging, but it needed. And using this, for instance, to replenish the IMF CCRT or doing subsidy accounts, it's a serious conversation. So that is a space, and if we're true about solidarity, I think we need to be talking these conversations. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, I would like to thank the group for including me and be part of it. It's an honor to be part of it, and also for the Academy and the Vatican for offering this opportunity. I would like to express one new term which didn't come up so far, which is the term resilience, the ability to bounce back after a shock. I think it's very important once you have a resilient society and can bounce back, growth will follow from that because people feel emboldened to take some risk and take some opportunities they wouldn't take otherwise. And so what we need is we need a global architecture which fosters this resilience and promotes resilience in that. And the current financial architecture is not appropriate and is poorly designed to assess the actual risk and leads to fund flows, which Martin mentioned before, very disadvantageous to the global south. And we have to think of a scheme which actually will rechannel the fund flows without having some interventions. Because when you give interventions from whatever organization it is, the Global South always comes as a beggar. But if you have a system which automatically does it, it's much more dignifying, essentially. You have a more dignifying system to these countries and also the citizens of these countries. And one of this resilience tool, the resilience tool which typically should serve this role, is a safe asset. A safe asset is an asset which I often say is a good friend. It's around when you need it. A good friend indeed is a friend in need. And a safe asset should maintain its value in crisis time. Could it be a global financial crisis? So what does the current system do? The current system essentially a flight to safety, as is expressed in the report. So essentially, whenever we go in a global crisis, the funds are flowing out of the global south to the global north. And that's very pro-cyclical for the global south, and it's counter-cyclical for the global north. So it leads to this strange phenomenon that the south has to go to austerity measures in times of crisis, has to cut back and make the crisis even worse for them. So they cannot bounce back. It's not resilient for them. While for the global north, the interest rate is going down, and they can go into debt and run fiscal stimulus programs, and this way get out of the crisis much more quickly. So the north seems to be much more resilient. But if you look at it from a macro perspective, it is essentially the case that the poor insure the rich, because the system is designed this way that whenever we go in a crisis, funds are flowing to whenever the marginal utility is very high or the crisis money is very valuable, it's much cheaper to raise funds for the north than it is for the south. And the south, especially in these difficult times, has a hard time to get out of that. And the question is, how can we set up a system where we don't have this flight to safety setting? And what is the underlying force? What is the underlying cause for this thing? And that's what Martin mentioned, this asymmetry. And the asymmetry is not in the amount of debt or number of bonds outstanding, but in the asymmetry, who supplies the safe asset. And right now, they say global safe asset is US Treasury. There are other advanced economies who can provide a safe asset. But that's where the fundamental problem is. Whenever there is flight to safety, there are cross-border capital flows from the south to the north. The question is, can we design, through some ingenuity and other devices, also safe assets coming from the emerging economies, coming from the south? And one way to do that is to actually bundle a lot of government bonds from the south and tranche it in a junior bond. And whenever there's flight to safety, it goes from the junior bond, which is, of course, from the global south, to a senior bond, which is also to the global south. So it's rather than having flight to safety across borders from the south to the north in crisis times, you have it over asset classes. So that's essentially one way you can do it. But more broadly, let me just step back. I think what we had so far, we had very much a global architecture, which was very rule-based. And based on these rules, you could have some multilateral organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and others. And this rule-based order is going away. We move to a much more bilateral arrangement, transactional arrangement. And what does this mean? It means essentially the power is shifting away from smaller, less developed countries to big trading blocs and big countries with huge economic power. There will be bilateral negotiations across the big trading blocs, but which will sideline all the smaller. And even within the trading blocs, smaller countries will have less influence compared to largers. So this power shift is very forceful to keep in mind, and there has to be a movement back to a more rule-based order. But one thing which I worry even more, of course, the problem with an asymmetric supply of a safe asset is that it leads to capital flows, but a world without a global safe asset would be even more risky. Okay, that could be another thing. So we have seen first sign that the US Treasury might lose the safety status. The way you model this or you get to this is when there is a crisis coming, like in April, there was this Liberation Day, what's the correlation or the co-movement across stocks, bonds, the government bonds, the safe asset, and the currency And the first time it was the case in the US, everything was co-moving. Rather than when the stocks go down, the bond is going up, the bond price was also going down. And the first signs that the safe asset status becomes more shaky, and having no global safe asset is even more problematic. So overall, I would say we should actually go beyond that, find an arrangement of this global safe asset supply, which is more symmetrically supplied, and also be aware that the global safe asset status is something to preserve, ideally in a symmetric fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And next we will have on Zoom Mariana Mazzucato, leading global expert on the economics of innovation, who had to stay in London because it's the annual meeting of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose that she heads at the University of College London. But thank you, Mariana, for stepping aside from this big meeting that you're leading to be with us today. So I will give you the floor now, and then we will continue the discussion. Thank you, Mariana.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And just a quick tech check. Can you hear me? You can hear my voice?
Very well.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you. Again, I'm very sorry I can't be here, but the Institute's actually about what I'm about to talk about, which is without state capacity, without public investment, then we can't actually tackle any of the problems out there. And so we need to remember that the debt crisis is as much a finance crisis as well as a real economy crisis. There's been chronic underinvestment in the real economy, and without fixing that root cause, debt relief alone, which we need, of course, becomes a revolving door. And Martin, you and I were just in Bellagio and Lake Como, where we were running through the Institute an event actually to talk about this. You know, how do we, for example, at the G20, in Seville, at COP, create a dialogue instead of a siloed one where we have one group of people talking about financial gaps, and there's a massive financial gap, we know, about 7 trillion around the SDGs, but then what is to be financed, right? If we want industrialization, if we want a greener economy, if we want a more inclusive economy, what does that mean for the structure of the finance? So it's less about financial gaps and more about shaping the finance. So first point, I'll be brief, is what I've just said. The debt crises are actually structural. They're not just fiscal. They're not just financial. Today's debt crises are, in fact, a symptom of broken investment models. For example, low-income countries' capital formation is stuck at something like 22% of GDP, way below middle-income peers, and infrastructure investments have been declining even as debt service has been going up. And over 60 countries now, I'm sure you've already talked about this, are spending more on debt than health, and 2.1 billion people live in countries that are spending more on debt than education. And without education, there's nothing to be done. So the solution has to be public investment strategies that are actually building the productive capacity, domestic value-added and sustainable fiscal space, anchored ultimately in strong state capabilities. And if we look at the IMF loans, I'd love to say in the olden days, unfortunately still today, the way that they have often been conditional for low-income countries on them cutting actually these very public investments that I'm talking about, just with some kind of numbers about deficit reduction without really thinking about the kind of active public investments we need for the denominator of debt to GDP, for the long run growth of GDP, which ultimately, even if you cut your deficit, debt to GDP can rise. Look at my own country, Italy. When we cut our deficit after the financial crisis, which was one of the conditions in order to receive the recovery loans, deficit fell, debt to GDP rose. So anyway, and also something that I just heard said by, I think, Marina, in order actually for MDBs to have investable projects, we actually need innovation systems on the ground that produce these bankable projects. There's just as much sometimes a demand for finance problem as there is a supply of finance problem. So we don't have enough firms that are able to scale, for example, through the kind of markets that maybe outcomes-oriented procurement provides in those very developing countries. In the US, by the way, all the startups scaled up through government-led, not only innovation on the supply side, but on the demand side, the market creation. But that's impossible if we don't have that kind of state capacity. Second, in thinking about not just the state, but the public-private partnership, that needs to be a good partnership. And unfortunately, we often have bad partnerships. And if you look at the blended finance schemes, they've actually often been part of the problem. So since Addis, the push to actually substitute overseas development assistance with private capital via different types of PFI and PPP schemes and blended finance has created new debt risks. And it's also been hidden, it's been pro-cyclical and often poorly governed. And we wrote a paper recently for UNDESA specifically on this, where, showing the data that blended finance simply has not delivered on different dimensions. The first is scale. We've had not the billions to trillions that is often talked about, but we're stuck at something like $15 billion a year in terms of blended finance. That's peanuts. Additionality, very low. Only about 39% is genuinely private money. The rest is public. The impact, not really clearly defined what we're trying to do. Coming back to my first point, financing what, and actually using the what to also design good partnerships. So very little developmental additionality. Sometimes also, by the way, just low additionality, which is measured by, did it catalyze investment to happen that would not have happened otherwise? Bad distribution. So in terms of geography, low-income countries receive only about 8% of blended finance since 2015, and also distributed problematically over sectors. Over 54% of blended finance has mainly gone to banking and large energy companies. So not to poor countries, not to local firms, and not to the more, ambitious areas that would really stretch what companies are doing in those countries and make things happen again that otherwise would not have happened, for example, around sustainable mobility. Fifth, I think, in terms of what blended finance has not done. So scale, additionality, impact, distribution. Lastly, debt risks. So this excess reliance on senior debt instruments and guarantees, which is often sitting off budget, it ends up hiding fiscal risks until the crisis hits. And even worse, they often privatize rewards but socialize those risks. So taxpayers in the countries carry the downside. So what's the solution? We need to solve all those problems instead of using the usual mantra, blended finance or financial gaps. We need a new social contract. All blended finance and PPPs, public-private partnerships, must be transparent, conditional on real local benefits, so jobs, technology transfer, affordability, and backed by a clear global standard for contingent liability disclosure. But this is also where the MDB reform that I heard was being talked about. This is another paper we've written for UNDESA. Currently, there's huge amounts of money also in the national development banks, over 23 trillion, only 2.2 trillion in the MDBs. And if there was a stronger link between them, precisely around some of these conditions I just talked about, and then a better relationship between the national banks and the private sector in the countries, we could get a true, what the head of the UN calls SDG multiplier. But that doesn't happen by just saying we need more, funding for the MDBs. And lastly, and I'll close, so my third point is that debt crises are indeed a global systemic risk, not just affecting the global south, which we correctly highlight, but also the global north. In 2022 alone, over 50 billion net flowed out of poorer countries, hurting global growth and stability. Debt distress triggers austerity, weaker health and education, as we mentioned, fuels migration and instability across borders. And the global north, frankly, has faced the same trap. Just remember the pigs, terrible Goldman Sachs word. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Investment growth has fallen from 4 to 5% of GDP in the 90s to less than 2% today. Debt burdens have surged in the global north. Public debt now averages over 112% of GDP across the G7. And what's to be done? Well, we need a stable international debt system that's not charity. It's the foundation for shared prosperity in an interdependent global economy. And super lastly, all the problems out there require a global response. The hydrological cycle, we've just done a report on this. So Extern did climate, this group did biodiversity. We did water with the president of Singapore and the head of the WTO, Ngozio Conjeweila and Johan Rockstrom. We co-chaired this with lots of commissioners. What we prove also in the report is literally deforestation in the Amazon has been proven by the science to cause droughts and floods in another part of the world. So this idea of actually having a stable international debt system, which is the foundation for shared prosperity in an interdependent global economy, is also a feature of what we need to actually solve the real economy problems that I began with: biodiversity, climate, water. On that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. So now I'll open the floor for discussion. We have, in the following order, Kevin Gallagher, then Domenico, and then Levan, right? You raise your hand. Good. So, Kevin, you go first.
Thanks. Great interventions today. I want to pick up on something that Ishak Dewan said earlier this morning and riff off of Mariana's conversation. Something that we have in the report is that the MDBs have to focus more on sort of mission-driven kind of policies rather than one-off little projects, which currently, with the exception of the World Bank, the majority of the financing is for projects. But on the other hand, we also have this principle of the no bailouts. And we need to figure out ways to reconcile that a little bit, right? So with project finance, the good thing is that a multilateral development bank has to create a special purpose vehicle that basically ring fences its ability to be able to pay Standard Charter and the China Development Bank. Whereas the policy loans are much more fungible. That's why the RST has been a failure. When you go interview all the countries that got the RST, it was for budget support. And so instead of, the RST is supposed to be for long-run balance of payments addressing issues to support resilience. Every country you talk to in Chatham House rules says that the money is way gone for salaries and Standard Charter. And so how do we design policy loans that are mission-driven, that allow countries to create an enabling environment for green structural transformation so that each project is wind in the sail of such an endeavor. Whereas right now, if you're doing just project finance and you don't have the policy environment right, those projects are sometimes a waste, and they're not going to have the spillover or growth impacts that they're supposed to have because they're going against the policy environment. But the problem is, well, from a debt sustainability perspective, the more fungible these assets are, the easier it is to pay Standard Charter with the money. And so I think in terms of, you said earlier, how do we make easier things? I wonder, it's a question, at the operational level, is it much more politically easy? Could we do something at the contract level of policy loans to make them less fungible, so that would help us adhere to this no bailout principle? Because if we do support mission-oriented policy loans, then for budget support to implicitly finance some green industrial policy, the odds are that's going to go to Standard Charter.
Thank you, Kevin. Next, Domenico Lombardi, who is a professor of public policy practice and the director of the Policy Observatory at the Lewis School of Government.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. Much appreciated. I just want to pick up on this issue of asymmetries and sort of try to link them up to the current political realities. One of the factors that we also need to acknowledge into the equation is that Europe, and by that I mean the European Union, is going to have less of fiscal space to sort of to play a supportive role, at least as we have seen it so far. Growth is deteriorating, fiscal pressures are increasing for a variety of factors, including the likely sort of increase of defense spending. Whether this is right or wrong is a topic for another session, but this is the reality in this continent. And so, having acknowledged that, maybe it's we could try to focus on sort of feasible reforms of the international financial architecture that do not contribute, do not escalate fiscal pressures, because they are more feasible. So the sort of point number one is the reform of the DSA, as a number of speakers have emphasized so far. The DSA reform, the DSA, and enhance the DSA that sends the right signal to the markets. And this is certainly something that we should pick up on and we should support. The second point is a topic particularly sort of it is particularly in my chords and has been raised by, again, a number of speakers, and has to do with SDRs. Clearly, as was pointed out, the US has a veto on the issuance of new SDRs. So it's not feasible, again, to talk about a new issuance, a new mega issuance, let alone a new issuance. However, there is still a significant stock of SDRs that is sitting idle in the balance sheet of Western central banks. And I think this is certainly something that we could pick up on because the mobilization of SDRs in the balance sheets of Western central banks do not go through the sort of the equivalent of the appropriation committee political process as we know it in the United States. And therefore, this is certainly something that could be more easily leveraged in the current political climate. So, of course, you know, think tanks are an important part of, an important intermediary between the political process and civil society. And I think many of us are affiliated or are part of the think tank community, and we should think of ways to mobilize our interest and our sort of network to try to mobilize, you know, maybe a more modest, more feasible, and for this reason, maybe more effective agenda that we could and should pursue. So thank you.
Thank you, Domenico. And again, glad to see the connection from about things that were discussed, were hard to discuss 15 years ago and are being discussed now. Like SDRs, Domenico was an executive director for Italy at the IMF about 15 years ago, if I remember correctly. So next, we have Levent Altinoglu, who is an economist at the US Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Well, since you mentioned my affiliation, I have to say these are my personal views only. So one point I just wanted to bring up related to discussion is the role that the international financial architecture plays in the production of safe assets. So I think, you know, most of us will agree that one of the main sources of the problem that, you know, these developing countries face is that it's costly for them to borrow in local currency because market participants rationally view local currency debt as riskier than dollar debt, right? This is the problem of original sin, of course, which means something different in economics than, otherwise. But I think an underappreciated point outside of, you know, this circle is that you know, the relative riskiness of different currencies, the relative riskiness versus their safety is driven in part by, you know, the institutional framework, the policies that are implemented by this post-Bretton Woods architecture. Because effectively, and this is discussed at length in the report, but these policies effectively treat local currency claims as having a higher seniority than dollar debt. And often that's not explicit, but that higher seniority of dollar claims vis-a-vis local currency debt kind of emerges from the macroeconomic consequences of these policies, right? For example, you know, and these policies are mentioned in the report. So bailouts by the IMF, the absence of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, limited use of capital account regulation. These policy choices have the effect of imposing the majority of the burden of adjustment on holders of local currency claims, right, through high inflation or depression or even outright default. And so those policy choices basically reinforce the relative riskiness of local currency claims and therefore can exacerbate this problem of original sin as an outcome of these policy choices. So, you know, I just, you know, thinking forward for you know, potential reforms, you know, any reforms will have to account for how the current, you know, financial architecture produces global safe assets, the role of the policies of these institutions, and how that can lead to inefficient risk-sharing arrangements in this manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Levent. And that's such an important comment that is actually discussed in the report. The issue, particularly in the context of the sovereign debt restructurings today, for countries that have debts both in local and in foreign currency. So a significant fraction of the countries that are under debt distress today also got financing in local currency, debt subscribed by international investors without the adoption of any capital account regulation. And if debts in local currency are treated the same way as debts in foreign currency, that's going to have medium-term consequences for the development of the possibility of financing in local currency for these countries. Therefore, it's going to make them even riskier in the future. So that's a very important matter. We now move to Eric Pelowski, who is the Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the commissioners for the incredible work that went into this report. I just wanted to pick up on one of the points made by the report and by Marina in her comments about expanding the capital that's available through the MDB system. For some of you, this will be a version of my broken record on the capital adequacy frameworks, where we think that there is still considerable amounts of money and headroom in the banks, including the World Bank, to be responding to the circumstances that we face that have been so carefully and effectively outlined by the Jubilee report. If one looks at that situation combined with the near collapse of ODA that is coming to us in the next 6 to 18 months, perhaps as much as $50 to $70 billion of fall off in ODA, it seems that any reform that we advocate for or anything that we do needs to take into account that there are going to be significant budget gaps that are coming because of those ODA cuts. So as a result, some of us have suggested that the World Bank could, in fact, undertake an additional change of its equity to loan ratio from 18% to 17%, unleashing about 30 to 40 billion in its lending headroom. It does have the practice of doing this. It has done so twice in the last 2 years, and that unleashed about 70 billion for the 2% reduction that it did over 2 years. From our point of view, it's also important what that money goes towards. And there are mechanisms that the World Bank has to address the current circumstances caused by the ODA falloff. In particular, the World Bank could use development policy loans, which are designed to rapidly disperse financing to help governments address actual or anticipated budget gaps. So these development policy loans could be made, they're short-term, using the additional funds that are created by an E to L change of 1%, and shore up the financial circumstances that developing countries are going to face because of the ODA cuts contagion. And so it's one option amongst a many number of proposals that are here, but it addresses one of the key elements of the Jubilee report, which is to expand capital. And it does so, by the way, with no additional cost to taxpayers, no additional cost to shareholders, no additional cost to anything within the existing system. This is money that exists within the banks that is not being lent because of its own assessment of its capital reserve requirements. But numerous studies, both by Fitch and by Risk Control, have demonstrated that there is sufficient headroom to make these kind of changes. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Eric. Very interesting. So Patrick Bolton next.
I have a comment on what Marina said and what Marcus said. So Marina, you highlighted that what we need ideally when there is a debt crisis is fast, deep enough, and counter-cyclical crisis resolution or debt resolution. And Marcus, you emphasized the idea that flight to safety could go across asset classes rather than from the south to the north, and basically money flowing from junior claims to senior claims, with the senior claims being a bundle of emerging market or low-income debt that, through the bundling, has lower risk. So what I want to add to that, which I think, these are both very important observations, is that there is, and this is on the contract design aspect of the report, that there is a contract design, I think, that we should encourage, that is not being used, which is a form of contingent convertible sovereign debt. And what I mean by that is this is sovereign debt, which would be issued in, usual currencies like dollars or pounds or yen, but should the country run into trouble, it should have the possibility of automatically triggering, or on its discretion, triggering the conversion of that dollar debt into local currency debt, okay? That could be done in a counter-cyclical way. That could be done quickly. It's automatic. It's in the terms of the contract. So it'd be and it can be done in a deep enough way. And I think, that kind of financial innovation, it's feasible. We need to encourage it. We need to create the market for it, of course, but that would be a good substitute for something that we don't have, which is a proper bankruptcy resolution mechanism for sovereigns.
Thank you. So next, Vera Songwe.
Sorry, I wanted to come back on 2 points. One that Mariana raised, but also on just the asymmetry in institutions. And I think, Levent, maybe you can help us with this, and then I'll also address the issue of safe assets. I think the prudential regulations, we've spoken a lot about sort of the fiscal side. It's a huge part, and the report touches on that. There's a huge asymmetry in prudential regulation, which is essentially penalizing many of the countries. And I take 2 examples of the Basel III regulations. And Basel III regulations requires banks to hold a lot more capital when they're investing in emerging markets than when they're investing in non-emerging markets. And so essentially, because the banks are required to hold a lot more capital, they charge the cost of the project. It is the right thing to do. You just transfer it. You hold your capital and you transfer the cost of that project onto the developing countries. But more importantly, the risk of many of those projects is in the first 3-4 years of sort of project development. After that, the risk goes down, but they are required to hold this capital for the 10-year life of the project. So essentially, there is a period there when they don't no longer need to be sort of freezing the capital and making it illiquid and making it costly for the developing countries. And I think we can look at those regulations. The same is true for insurance companies. For insurance companies, they have a capital charge if they're investing in any non-OECD country. So it doesn't matter if you're doing exactly the same project. Singapore is not an OECD country, for example. So Singapore, it will cost them a lot more money to do exactly the same solar energy project as it will cost. It will cost them 45% more than it will cost in Greece, that is an OECD country. So just defining risk by geography, and more importantly, by whether you're OECD or not, is something that I think we could very easily maybe make a pledge to see whether we can lift, because it will drastically reduce the cost of capital for these 2 countries. And finally, the third one on safe assets. We're now doing something where we're trying to bundle African sovereign bonds into different sort of safe asset bonds that eventually Africans can reinvest in. The problem is, again, the liquidity definition, because no African sovereign bond is liquid. Essentially, when there is a crisis, nobody can come to safety in that basket. And we had one of the extraordinary cases where Namibia, because Namibia's currency is tagged to South Africa, but South Africa's currency is not considered a highly liquid asset. And so Namibia actually is not allowed in principle, even though it's currently pegged to the rand, and it's one of its largest trading partners, to have rands in its reserve basket, except under extreme conditions. And I think one of the things that we could start trying to do, and we're now in the process of doing that, is to see whether we can package some of this African paper and maybe get guarantees around them, which will enhance their credit rating, and the IMF can consider them safe assets. And I think this is something that we can do, is begin to see how can we create safe assets in the South, and it is doable. And we're in the process now of at least testing a first case.
Thank you, Vera. Mahmoud Mohelen, next.
Right, thank you so much. A couple of points on this frequently raised issue on the SDRs and their potential use after recycling them. I just referred here to Google just to remember when exactly the IMF blessed the use of SDRs to MDBs for use as hybrid capital. I was for more than a year, in the 10th of May. Some of us, I was in the room then. Some of us didn't even feel that there was a need for a board decision, but a board decision was made. Since then, nothing happened. We are still waiting for 5 signatures from 5 countries with extra SDRs, as mentioned by Domenico and others, that they may not really need it. We're stuck with some specific rulings. One by the European Central Bank, that this may not really be used for anything but for international reserves of the concerned countries. Then other countries are constrained by political reasons. So we can be specific, either to convince the European Central Bank to be more flexible in a good day, that could be useful. The other thing, and we have a good leadership there, but she's not alone. There is a board and there is an institution and there are different views. I mean here the former MD of the fund and the current head of the ECB, Christine Lagarde. And then we have other countries, including UK, Japan, Canada, and some of the Gulf countries that could really be helpful, because it seems that everybody is happy with the proposal that came from the IDB or the African Development Bank and then the IDB. So what's preventing that from happening is basically some sort of an agreement. And I bet that this will be one of the things that are going to be discussed, at least at the margins of Seville. And that will not be the first time or the second or third, and I hope it will be the last time before we get that into implementation. And there are some lessons learned, if I'm as optimistic as Mark and others, that SDRs could be issued in the future, of the conventional SDRs as we know them. Perhaps, as I was chatting with Vera, that could be an agreement, a gentleman or a smart women agreement before the distribution of the SDRs, the new SDR, there will be allocation for the countries in need. So we don't distribute and then chase the money, because since the issuance of SDRs in 2020, we have been in this kind of interesting game. And when they are relent or recycled, they are going through some institutions, including the IMF, that you need to have a program, eligibility criteria, and qualifying criteria for you to, as a country, to benefit from. Then the interesting idea of reflected here in that could be other arrangements, as mentioned by Joe and in the report, that countries with acceptable rating that could really issue something similar. That's an interesting idea. It has, of course, many conditions for that to be successful and to be implementable and to be used as the SDRs, but we see that there is a great deal of tendency for regional solutions. I see the ASEAN countries very much qualified for that, perhaps with the help of the Asian Development Bank. One more point, actually 1.5, on the club, on the Borrowers Club, because we spoke a lot about the issues related to the external debt, assuming that the domestic debt will take care of itself. And we know that in many countries, they would benefit from a great deal of scrutiny when it comes to local currency issuance. And in many cases, they just inflate their way out of their domestic debt. And there is something dancing between the external and the domestic market, which is basic, as mentioned by Martin, the issues related to the carry trade. And this is, again, something that could be expected from the operationalization of responsible lending and borrowing that shouldn't be just for the external borrowing, but for the domestic one. And the very final point, ODA, yes, ODA has been in the decline for quite some time. In real terms, in relative terms, 2024 with worse than 2023. Of course, there is the drama in the room. I agree with Eric that we need to be prepared for those days. There are countries that are more dependent on ODA than others. If I compare Rwanda to Burundi, or both countries to Morocco and Egypt. And there could be a blessing in disguise for some countries, as I was chatting with Mavis, that this could be a solution for what Easterly warned us about many years ago, about the abuse of aid and the white man's burden and all of this kind of interesting discussion. But we need to have something in the transition, and there is some good arguments, including by Brookings and Homi Kharas and others, in what's classified as old ODA with new ODA, with new contributors, and with new rules of using ODA. But meanwhile, there will be a great deal of disruption, including some of the proposals here, including debt swaps, that could be impacted because they are dependent in their mechanisms of some great deal of concessional elements for them to happen.
Thank you, Mahmoud. So we're getting to more interventions from Juan Chanove from FAO, Marina, and Marcus again. And then Joe, who raised a hand? Oh, Jamie. Okay, so there will be four brief interventions, and then Joe will conclude. Juan, you go first. Juan from the FAO.
Thank you. Very two quick points. One is, again, on the point of the currency of your debt, how that can actually also shape your development policy and your investments. I mean, I'm thinking on countries that have to choose for cash crops for exports just because they need to collect that external currency, and how that determine even their food security and so on. But the other element I want to put on the table is in terms of the UN institutional architecture. And I remember I read in the report this idea that I'm really very fond of the bankruptcy court or bankruptcy mechanism. But I wonder, maybe it's in the report, I just read it in the evening. Some civil society organizations have also been talking on the necessity of a UN framework convention on sovereign debt, right? That could kind of comprehensively address illegitimate debt, right? And the other one in terms of institutionality is the notion of an international sort of public credit rating agency in the UN that could eventually counterbalance the, so any thoughts on that matter?
Thank you. I actually would like to give a step back and go back to actually the title of our session, that is a reimagined international financial architecture, a solidarity approach. So as my formation as an economist comes a lot from Keynesian, so I came from, my university was really like Keynesian approach. And I think at this time, maybe we all should revisit two books from Keynes. The first one is The Economic Consequences of Peace, where he highlighted, after the World War I, how the reparations on Germany could actually cause a lot of social problems. And unfortunately, this was actually what caused. And I think this highlights a lot the problem of very high debt burdens combined with austerity, and what are the social problems that this could create. So I think this is the first one that we need to bear in mind when you're talking about austerity, the need of more finance, debt relief. That is a social cost that is very important, and we need to bear this in mind. The second one, which is really looking forward, reimagining the international financial architecture, is the economic possibility to my grandchildren. So I think also moving to the next session, I think we need to, what could we build from a new international financial architecture that we are going to look to the next generations, is actually, we are going to say in the next Jubilee, what is going to be, the new gains for our children, grandchildren, and actually they live in a planet that is livable and more, wealthier than we are. So I will stop here, but I think maybe sometimes we need to go back to the traditions, and these are two good books maybe for now. Yeah, thank you.
Marcus Runnermeyer, please.
Yeah, just have a clarifying question about the SDRs arrangement. So there are two discussions which came up. One is that our new SDRs are generated, but then let's suppose a country has additional SDRs. It still has to go to some other country, to some advanced country, and convert it into dollars or euros. And this is still up to the country whether they want these SDRs in exchange to their own dollars or euros. So there's still another bottleneck. You might just get the SDRs and can't do anything because nobody wants to convert it into hard currency. So the other thing is, what's about these idle sitting SDRs at the ECB or other central banks? It's also not obvious, so it's saying, the ECB would just say, we give these SDRs, which are our assets, so these are ECB assets, we give it to some other bank, other central bank or some other country. And then this other country has SDRs now and has to convert it into some euros. So they come back to the ECB and say, we would like to convert it to euros and you have your SDRs back. So then he could have given the euros as a gift in the first place. So that's what I don't fully understand, how the SDRs would help in this regard. I mean, of course, it's a channel to get to around some accounting or some legal procedures, but you could just give the gift in the first place.
Thank you, Marcus. We don't have much time, Mark, but I understand you want to make a brief point after Jamie, who is first in line on the SDRs. And I don't know, Brad, you have a great idea on the issuance of an SDR-linked bond. I don't know if you want to add a comment on the liquidity for SDRs or just leave it for discussion later. Think about it. Jamie, you go next.
Thank you, and I'm pretending to be Kevin Gallagher, which is a great honor. Actually, I was going to talk again about the SDR question, because Mahmoud, you said nothing had happened. And I guess my point would be, we've tried to make something happen, so that there's been a lot of happening without result. We've done a lot of work on trying to get those SDRs recycled, for example, to the African Development Bank. And it's really important that we kind of absorb the reasons we're being given as to why they won't do it, and figure out what our answers are, or our best process to come up with answers are, or we have to stop putting political capital into something where we're getting a no. And that's one of the other, we have to imagine we have 100 political units, or units of political capital, and we've got to apply them where we're most likely to get results, strategic things that unlock further change. And we have to at some point decide we're not gonna advance this one because it's not happening. But the answer we keep getting back, for example, from the UK, is they cannot calculate. And it's a slightly different point, I think. They cannot calculate exactly and precisely how policy ready an SDR, once it's gone on this journey, is. And because they can't be very precise about an answer to that, they can't have the conversation. To me, that sounds like it should be an answerable question, but who's got the answer? Because if you've got the answer, it'd be great to have it, so that next time we have the conversation, at least that excuse is taken out of the room. They can come back in with another excuse. But we've got to be systematic about getting excuses out of the room. And anyone doing this advocacy in any other place, in any other market, needs to share that feedback very systematically about what we're hearing about the arguments against these things. Because otherwise our advocacy is like a game of whack-a-mole, and the arguments against just sort of reappear in slightly different forms in different markets, and we won't advance. So, but we can advance if we're strategically aligned and organized and sharing intelligence rapidly.
In terms of the SDRs and how they can be used and are used. First of all, the addition to the reserves by itself does a lot, because the SDR is considered a reserve that's as good as a treasury. Okay, it's not going to be defaulted on. And so what a lot of countries did was they cashed in other reserves, that liquid reserves, and just kept the SDR. So that was a way that it became even more like cash. The second thing was you raised the problem, potential problem that the European Central Bank would end up giving over euros for SDRs, and so why don't they just give the euros? Well, it is different because it's a voluntary arrangement where the IMF has a rule that if a country needs to convert SDRs to cash, then some country will step forward, and that's pretty much always happened. And you can kind of expect it would, because the SDRs are just as good as anything else. I mean, as good a reserve as you can get. So why wouldn't a country come forward and do that? And so that's probably not going to be a problem. So what we're really talking about is the IMF can't do quantitative easing because it doesn't have its own currency. And so what the SDR is the next best thing. You create an international reserve asset that's convertible inside the IMF to a currency, and that really works. First of all, to stabilize all the countries that don't even convert them, and to give them, help them avoid balance of payments crises, interest rate increases, fiscal crises, and other things that they would have. And secondly, to be able to convert them when they need to. And so I think it really does work. Nobody's raised any real problem with them so far. And you got a lot of people, just Republicans who didn't even say anything until after Trump left, okay? Because they decided they could use it as a political football against their opponents and try and make up stories about how China's going to use them, which they don't. And all the, they don't even get in the media with this stuff. It's because it's that ridiculous, okay? So there isn't any real opposition in the public debate that has come from economists, for the most part, or economic arguments. And I think that we really don't have to worry. What we have to worry about is just the reasons that I talked about, which again are speculative about why they don't do what is something that costs actually no money whatsoever from the U.S. Treasury. That's also another thing that makes it very feasible going forward, and that Wall Street is in favor of it also. And there are all these other things that make it possible, and there's really not anything that we have to worry about in terms of arguments about inflation or other stuff that people can make up.
Okay, listen, I know, Marcus, you opened a very important door, and that's fantastic. No, Domenico, sorry. So there are many people in this room that have worked on the SDRs. So we could have a full workshop on special drawing rights, but unfortunately we don't have the time. So I know, so Brad Setzer, Eric Pelowski are going to speak very briefly. Vera, you have something that it must be said now. We add it quickly, and then I have to turn the floor to Joe to conclude, because otherwise we won't have time to have the session on debt and climate, which is very important. Climate change is clearly defining theme for humanity today. SDRs might be able to help with that. So that's why I give a little bit more time to SDRs. So Brad, Eric, and Vera, and then we close.
Thank you very much. I'll take up the challenge that Jamie just posed. One objection that is often raised in central banking circles, particularly in the UK and in Europe, is that very much relates to the argument that Marcus made, which is that in practice, converting an SDR into foreign currency is not a simple matter. It requires going through the voluntary trading arrangement, and most liquidity has been supplied by Europe and the United States, just as a matter of tradition. I do think that one could imagine significant reforms to the voluntary trading arrangements that put much more of the burden of supplying, or opportunity, don't mean to be pejorative, of supplying liquidity against SDRs on those countries with the most reserves. China, I would think, would be a natural supplier of dollars and euros against SDRs, and China, I think, from its perspective, would be gaining the opportunity to diversify in a healthy way. But that is one critical, practical solvable, in my view, issue. The other issue comes, and I think, to be honest, the ECB has concluded that the Africa Development Bank and the other hybrid capital proposals are a step too far. That hybrid capital is something normally provided by fiscal authorities. It isn't often held as a reserve asset, despite the IMF rules that I know allow it. The ECB has not reached the same conclusion. And so therefore, it is effectively off the table for the Europeans. And because it is off the table for the Europeans, the liquidity of the SDRs that are provided as capital, which is not naturally a liquid asset, is called into question. So realistically, that proposal, unless some other group of countries is willing to do it, faces some big difficulties. One option is to downgrade your expectations, not look to the SDRs as a source of capital, but to look to the SDRs as a source of long-term funding. And that was the proposal that Stephen Paduano and I put forward for an SDR-linked bond that settles in foreign currency. Now, you still have to solve the VTA problem, but liquidity is provided by the market. And therefore, it is a natural reserve asset. It is a dollar or euro bond sold by a AAA institution. By the way, I note that the US is not a AAA issuer anymore. So it's a credit upgrade, which may help offset the possible modest reduction in liquidity. But in order for that to be viable, I think there needs to be clarity about the distinction between hybrid capital and a senior bond. There needs to be more testing of the ECB's position. I think their directive allows this, but it is a debate. And then I think it would really, really help if a few countries, and it won't be mine, would indicate that they are willing to buy such bonds. My understanding is that the World Bank treasurer is willing to issue if someone can come up with a buyer.
Yeah, I'll be really fast. As I savor the opportunity to talk about SDR rechanneling, because of the amount of pain it's caused all of us over the course of the last 2 years. I think I've been at the forefront with Jamie and others at the AFDB trying to bring this to life, SDR rechanneling, which would take the SDRs and multiply them by 3 or 4 into new lending into the African continent and then into the Latin American continents through the IADB. The fact of the matter is, and I take what Brad says, I appreciate that the ECB has put forward a very, for this proposal, unhelpful position. I would certainly say I think either path is viable if there's political will. And fundamentally, at present, there isn't. And why isn't there? Because the need has not been presented and the options or the illusory options remain. This will, whether it's the bonds or the rechanneling themselves, will move when by necessity there are no other options. This is an option that produces considerable leverage of waning or basically wasting assets that are not being used by virtue of the definition of wasting, that could be leveraged to solve problems in Africa and in Latin America and even in Asia. We could rechannel SDRs if we wanted to, and we just have to decide how urgent the need is and what are the other options. And right now, given the circumstances, there aren't a lot of other viable options, and this one produces a huge amount of leverage. So thank you.
I'm going to be really quick. I think 2 things. It is 2 ways, and Eric, I think we should stop saying rechanneling. It's on lending, and the on lending is linked a little bit to your point, because essentially there's no rechanneling. What happens with SDRs as a safe asset is you have to pay to convert them from the safe asset that they are to something that gets transferred to a treasury that can be usable. And so it's a actually, the developed world, every time they give SDRs to the developing world, we pay for it. They make money off of it. So it's not charity. We actually pay for it. We lend the money. That's one. But secondly, and I think to your point, Jamie, is that And I give you a very concrete example. For COVID, we took African countries' SDRs. They had 37.5 billion of SDRs were allocated to Africa. We took 2.2 billion, we took 1 billion of that. We were able to leverage it to 2.2 billion, and Africa was able to go and stand in line and say, I have money, I'm going to buy my own COVID medicines. That's the way Africa got COVID vaccines. It's because we didn't go to the donors. We went to the African countries who had gotten the SDRs, and we said to them, give us some equivalent of your SDRs, but your reserves, so exactly, don't convert, keep the SDRs in your reserves, give us the dollars, and then we took it, leveraged it, and bought the COVID. And that's why I've been saying for the last 3 years, forget about on-lending, rechanneling, let's go for new. If we get new, 37.5, you leverage it by 10, it's African SDRs, it's our money. We're not asking anybody for on-lending, for rechanneling, for anything. It's new money that we can now take to the market and do good, do better, and do faster with. So this is the reason why I think it's so much better, so much more straightforward. And if there is some room for doing new issuances, let's go.
Thank you. So now it's time to conclude. So Joe Stiglitz has the floor.
Okay, just a few comments. First, I think one way, at least I thought about this in the beginning, is the perversity of global capital markets. They function the opposite way that we're taught that they're supposed to function. It's the rich who are supposed to be able to absorb risk, and risk from the poor should be transferred to the rich. That's not what's happening. That's the point about the pro-cyclical capital flows on the part of with respect to developing countries. Money moves when there's risk to the safe havens, rather than the safe havens being the rich countries providing the money. So in a way, one begins with a recognition that capital markets are not functioning the way perfect markets would work. And that raises the question, where is the market failure? What is going wrong? And there are many things, and we've touched on some of them, about why it is that there are some natural aspects that the rich countries have more resources to bail out their banks. So if you put money in a rich country, you are safer. It's what happened during the Euro crisis. Money went from Greece to Germany. It was actually at a European level exactly the same kind of a phenomena. So that's the first point, that we are working in our analysis in a very difficult space, because economists are used to thinking about perfect markets. And here we're repairing some really imperfect markets, and we have to diagnose and repair what is the source of imperfection. And there's going to likely be more disagreement on that. The second observation, it hasn't come up much in this discussion here, but comes up in other contexts, is that during Climate Week in New York, you hear the word blended finance infinitely often. And there's a view that somehow blending finance is magic and yields more money out of nowhere. It's a kind of alchemy. And those of us who were trained in finance know a theorem called the Modigliani-Miller theorem that says when you mix in perfect markets, when you mix different kinds of things, you don't get anything extra. You're just shifting risk from one place to another, but the net result is zero. But there's also a lot of theory explaining why the Modigliani theorem, this theorem, which is central theorem in finance isn't normally true. There's a whole industry in the southern tip of Manhattan devoted to making money out of the fact that it isn't working. But they don't explain what they're doing. All they know is they're engaging in arbitrage because markets don't work. But they make a lot of money out of doing that. So there's a lot, it's another example of in another context, markets not working. So a lot of our discussion has been, I think, very constructively talking about what can we do to make the markets work better in ways that advantage developing countries and eliminate some of the deficiencies in the current arrangements which penalize poor countries and poor people. And I just want to first, I think, commend during the discussion today, we've had some, I think, very original ideas that we haven't talked about in our report, contractual arrangements of having tranches within developing countries, the contingent contracts. I think these are interesting contractual arrangements. What happened in Switzerland with contingency contracts has made people a little bit nervous about that, but maybe not. Maybe there are ways of implementing. I guess that should remind us, every institutional innovation has implementation problems. And so SDRs have problems, but so do any other private sector solution. So that, I think the contractual arrangements, these are really interesting things that need to be explored in further work. The second thing we haven't talked about very much are better institutional arrangements for risk sharing. We talk about them a little bit in our report. For instance, climate change is a global risk imposed on developing countries. They didn't create much of the pollution, particularly Africa didn't contribute much. China now has contributed a very large share, but the point is that in our report we talk about a commodity stabilization regime system. So there are some things that one might be able to do institutionally to share risk, and share risk in ways that would reduce the riskiness of individual countries in Africa. MDBs are another way of doing that, because you have borrowing across a group of countries. The point is that kind of risk sharing makes each country safer, should lower the risk premium, and therefore reduce some of the perversity in the capital flows which have to do with risk. So I think that's another area that needs more exploration going forward. And the third, again, that's been raised is recognition that institutions matter, and that some of our current institutional arrangements exacerbate the problem, and that there are some institutional innovations that could reduce the problem. So it's been mentioned how Basel exacerbates the problem. That's been long recognized. I don't want to say there was any intent in making regulations, but I think there was a lack of consciousness of the global systemic consequences. They were looking at it from the point of view of banking, not from the point of view of systemic performance of the global financial system. And I think it's really time for us to try to revisit that from a global, tell Basel, you really have to think about this not only from the point of view of banks as the objective of economic policy, but it's really growth in people as the objective of economic policy, and that might lead to alternative. Central banks have always focused on their internal domestic concerns and not on the global consequences. I remember talking to one of the governors of the Federal Reserve about how their policies in raising interest rates in early 1980s led to the Latin American debt crisis. There was one governor who said, I told them it was going to do this. And the response of the chair of the Federal Reserve said, that's not our mandate. Our mandate is U.S. domestic policy. If it kills the rest of the world, that's their problem. And so I think in the world we live today, I think that may not be as acceptable. He never said this publicly, so it may not, he probably still wouldn't say it publicly, but I think trying to raise the consciousness about the global effects of the large country central banks and large country financial policies on the global economy. The irony is the IMF and the World Bank talk about how the policies of small countries which have no global consequence except local consequence on their own. So they intervene in the cases where there are no externalities and are not intervening in the cases where there are large externalities. I think we want to try to change the mindset about that. Other institutional things we've talked about, the rules, regulations, like about capital market liberalization, which make the developing countries more volatile. WTO regulations, which don't allow adjustment of tariffs and don't allow the use of quotas, increase trade volatility, and contribute to macroeconomic volatility. There's finally one thing that we talk a lot about in the report, but it hasn't come up as much, are the DSAs. And we provide a critique. Let me emphasize why why it's so important to do a better job. Because one of the things, DSAs provide the framework for the debt restructuring. They give guidance to how much debt reduction is necessary if debt is going to be returned to sustainability. If you think that there's more capacity to bear debt, you don't have as much debt restructuring, and then you have a debt crisis 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. And that's been a systematic characteristic of the global financial market. And so the DSAs not only impede restructuring, as I mentioned before, but they also mean that the restructurings tend to be not sufficiently deep. There's systematic biases. You look at the results of the DSAs, they're over-optimistic in the context of restructuring of what the country can do. And the result of this is this repeated cycle of debt. And finally, I can't help but weigh in a little bit on the SDR issue and to echo it in a way what Eric said, which is if there's a will, there's a way, that fixing the institutional arrangements to make this work, I believe, is clear. But I also want to emphasize that it's important, we've talked about it mostly in terms of providing money for a flow of money to our developing countries, because it's obviously ODA is going to go down. We need money for climate, and the developed countries have promised 100 billion or 200 billion, and they haven't produced it, and the likelihood going forward is even more dismal. So here is another thing that is of global importance, that we have that a source of funds. But it also addresses the counter-cyclical, the pro-cyclical issue, because I think you could issue them in ways that are counter-cyclical to the countries when they need them. So if you think, as you've said on other occasions, that this pro-cyclical behavior is part of the core problem, this is an instrument that, if we can get it to work, and I believe we can help alleviate that pattern. It's an institutional arrangement. It's based on trust, like all monetary arrangements. You know, you wonder, why does anybody accept the US dollar, especially with Trump? It's a mystery to me. When the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors has announced that he plans to have a default and says, if you're lucky enough to hold US Treasury bonds, I'm going to offer you the opportunity of getting a century bond, a 100-year bond at a zero interest rate. That's a wonderful deal if you want it, but since that's been announced as the policy, the Mallargo Accord, you might think that the markets might have recognized that there's some risk there. Evidently, they don't take it seriously. So anyway, financial arrangements have to be based on trust. And I think if there's a will, there's a way to get the SDRs to work.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. We also have the participation of His Excellency Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of Nigeria and currently the head of the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative. So I hope the discussions that we're having here are also helpful for the work of the African leaders on the Debt Relief Initiative. And we look forward to your comments in the last session after the coffee break. So we're going to have a quick coffee break. We are about 45 to 50 minutes delayed only. So let's keep the coffee break really short. Get our coffees and back to the room. And in 10 minutes, we should be discussing climate. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to reconvene now. And this is our penultimate session. As we already said this morning, it's going to focus on debt and climate. I just made a check of the reports. We actually have climate mentioned 35 times in the report. Yeah, right across the whole of the report. But it's also inspired, as we said this morning, by the request of Cardinal Parolin that we bring this idea of ecological debt into the discussion and gradually work on it in the future. It's a bit different from what the report was focusing on, but there's obvious connections with the debt and climate issue. So we've seen here a few little points: the debt for climate instruments, the aligning debt relief with climate action and shared global interests. We've got the ESG frameworks and integrating ESG frameworks with debt reform policy. These are the kinds of issues that are relevant to our topic now. So we're running a bit late, so I just want to hand over straight away to our discussants. We've got Leonardo Becchetti, who's a professor of economics here in Rome and has been doing quite a lot of work on the question of debt for climate swaps. Then we will pass over to His Excellency Yemi Osinbajo of the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative that we already spoke a little bit to him at the end of the last session. Sebastian Seria, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it properly, founder and president of Funda. And then Frederick Samama, who's a professor in Columbia. He will be the last person before we'll open the floor for a general discussion. So first of all, I hand over to Leonardo. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Ellen. And just want to show you one slide to stay in the 5 minutes. Okay, so one bad news, temperature is going up. You can see also here in Rome. July and August were wonderful months when I was young, and now are terrible months. They are not the best months, definitely. London is becoming what Rome was before, and Rome a bit down. But the good news is that last year, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, tells us that 93% of the new installed capacity is from renewable in the world. So basically, decarbonization is going on, and is definitely working very, very, very strong. You know, for California, dates are 3 days out of 5, 100% renewable last year. I'm not going too much into this one. Another good news is that the forecasts of the International Energy Agency are constantly downward biased. So they always make very good expectations. Now they think they are tripling the installed capacity, but they always make a mistake downward. You see all the horizontal lines are the previous forecast, and the reality is the line going up. But this is, I mean, we don't know whether we are running enough, quick enough. And so going to our point, so that's an important point. The distribution of the efforts is not evenly distributed from a geographical point of view. As you see, Africa is much less, of course, that's proportional also to economic activity, but is definitely doing much less than Asia and Europe. Also because, as Irina tells, the cost of the investment is higher, the risk is higher, there are not electric grids, and so it's a lot of problems, and the capacity of the electric grids is important, okay? So what is my point? As you see in the report, there are 3 very important issues on debt for climate swaps. They say they should not be substitute for debt restructuring. They say they shouldn't create a trade-off with investment in poverty reduction, so the compatibility between environmental sustainability and social sustainability, that's another thing very important. And also, transaction costs shouldn't be too big. Okay, there is a lot of suspicion on the civil society when you use the word swaps, because the idea is that lots of money goes to intermediaries with cartolarization and with these things. So what is my point? My point is that we should do something simple, scalable, and easy to understand with low transaction costs. So basically, what about the idea of a creditor accepting that the debt service of debtor is converted into a guarantee development funds for high social and environmental impact in the debtor country. And the investment that can use this fund must be evaluated using a high standard ESG criteria multi-stakeholder system. I can tell you my private experience. I bring Italian green government bonds on the international market, so I do that for climate. And we have a very nice slide that the investors likes a lot, where we explain any euro invested, how much is the effect on reduction of carbon emission, how much is the effect on employer multiplier, how much is the effect on GDP multiplier. And basically 3 types of investment: railways, electrification of transport, that's the transportation, cold ironing also in transportation. The other one is new renewable capacity. In Africa could be mini grids, that's very important now. And the third is efficiency of housing, house retrofit, net zero buildings and these things. Okay, of course, there are many other issues, but there are a lot of investment which can reconcile social, environmental, and economic sustainability. Why this could be? Of course, the thing works whether if they are of mutual interest between creditor and debtors. Why that should be of interest of creditors? Some reason. One, mitigation is a global public good. The effort of the debtor is important. Second, adaptation is important. Climate shocks hit especially debtor countries, many of the debtor countries, and then this can be, and if we do something for adaptation, we reduce solvency risk of the debtor country. We can also do something similar to what we do with the loss and damage funds for climate shocks. Third, investment, this is a very delicate point, but if we use rigorous standards, we can accept that investment can come from companies of the investor country, which must meet the rigorous standards. There is also interest of debtor, of course, because the reputation of debtor can be higher on the international markets if we use these metrics and these standards. And also, as far as you grow in the installed capacity from renewables, you can reduce your dependence from energy imports, which is a problem for your balance of payment. So the idea is that this can be an initiative that can be simple, can be scalable. We are trying to start with the small projects between Zambia and Italy to show that it can work. And we see. And making a comparison, my last point, to what is actually on the field. It looks like much less the Bridgestone swap initiative, because that's very much into the idea of cartolarization and swaps, and then high transaction cost. It looks like much more the Spain Sustainable Partnership Agreements, which is tailored country by country with the metric chosen by the debtor and the creditor. So I think that's what is closer to our idea, of course, but our idea is related to debt for climate. So I think that's the way that we should do to reconcile economic development and sustainability, social and environmental sustainability. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leo. It's also, I think, an interesting example of connecting real economy with finance that we were talking about, especially Mariana was talking about earlier. Okay, so now we're very happy to pass the speaking role to His Excellency.
Thank you very much, Sister Helen. Let me join everyone who has congratulated the Commission for this bold and provocative report. Bold because I think it challenges us to confront an issue that's hardly ever mentioned in debt discussions, namely morality. The first paragraph of the conclusion of the report, I just quote, it's just 3 lines. Resolving a sovereign debt crisis is a deeply political and moral undertaking. It is at its core question of how the question of how losses are distributed across societies, generations, and international actors. And like all questions of distribution, it can be a source of conflict, end of quote. I think the moral question of how losses are distributed is important in thinking through the justification for debt relief. Morality in the sense of what is fair and what is just. And Africa in particular, I think, is fair to say that the continent is faced with two existential crises, climate being one, but the second, of course, and possibly more important, is poverty and stalled development. Yet, Africa is the fastest warming planet today, is worst hit by the devastations of the climate crisis. And that, of course, causes substantial GDP losses. African nations lose up to between 2 and 5% of their GDP annually from climate extremes, and between 5 and 15% on GDP per capita. Some countries even allocate up to 9% of national budgets for adaptation efforts already. Yet, the continent is the least emitter of dangerous gases, so the least contributor to the climate crisis, and the worst sufferer of its consequences. So for Africa, the crucial question then is, how can the continent develop, provide well-paying jobs, decent lives for its growing population within carbon constraints? Historically, economic growth goes hand in hand with emissions growth. And this is the pathway that the global north countries have gone, which has brought us to the imminent apocalypse. So in resolving the climate crisis, an important developmental opportunity may have emerged. It is evident that if Africa were to grow along the same carbon-intensive trajectory that the global north has gone to attain middle to high-income status, we'll be pumping about 9.4 gigatons of CO2e annually. And by 2050, we'll be responsible for 75% of global emissions. Now, but worse is that the world will not attain its net zero objectives if Africa goes the same way as the global north has gone. It will simply be impossible for the world to attain net zero objectives. So the world needs Africa to grow along a carbon positive pathway. And it makes sense because Africa is climate competitive. We have renewable energy, over 60%, critical minerals, a youth population that can make this happen. So climate positive growth as a development paradigm is possible. Africa can therefore be, if you like, the solution to the climate crisis, or perhaps the nemesis of the world. How do we then do this? How does this climate positive growth thing work? That simply is a green pathway to economic growth. In other words, Africa can actually adopt a green pathway to economic growth in its own interest, in its own development interest, and in the interests of the world also. If that is possible, the only question is how. How will we do that? I think already, and I've made the point that Africa is climate competitive, as the world increasingly pays for climate solutions through consumer preferences, price on carbon, or rules that force a shift to lower emission solutions. The places in the world that can provide green solutions most competitively have a massive economic opportunity. And so thanks to all the natural endowments of Africa, that is entirely possible. Now, what do we need for that to happen? The first, of course, is appropriate and sufficient capital, which comes round to the question of how. And then secondly, market access. I'll just talk about the questions around appropriate capital, which is really why the whole question of debt for climate, the whole question of debt relief comes into play. Now, the report talks extensively about debt for nature, which I think is perfect. But I think that a wider a wider context should be debt for climate for positive growth, climate positive growth, debt for climate positive growth. So we'll be looking at a situation where we're saying that Africa needs this debt relief, and we can look at the detail, which I'm not going to go into, precisely to be able to pursue a pathway, a development paradigm that emphasizes green growth. And to do so, obviously, there will be a need for debt relief, and depending on what the quantum that we're talking about is. And that really is entirely possible. Because if you look at it, Africa today can provide, just relying on its renewable energy resources alone, it can provide enough energy for 600 million of those who do not have power today at 30% lower cost, with over 90% lower emissions per kilowatt hour. And all that requires is the investment to do so. So I think that appropriate and sufficient capital can actually be provided if the world sees this as an important opportunity, not only to lighten the debt burden, but more importantly, to put Africa along the pathway of green growth, which of course would mean that the world can then attain its own net zero objectives. I'll leave it at that. I wanted to just talk, maybe just say something briefly about market access. Obviously, the second part of that, of access to capital, is also market access. And when you look at the CBAMs and some of the other obstacles, obviously there's a need to address those in order to give market access for even the products that Africa has at the moment. And if we're able to look at those in a fair and just way, we'll find ourselves in a situation where, without doing much more than allowing sufficient room for allowing sufficient debt relief, we'll be able to tackle some of these issues. But obviously, there's a need for market access, and there's a need for capital. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for that very illuminating intervention. So now we'll go to Sebastian Seria.
Sorry, there you go. I would like to go back to the issue of the procyclical nature of capital markets, and I would like to do it maybe in a different capacity as somebody who has been a practitioner, who has spent many decades in the financial sector and have observed the dynamics of the industry firsthand, sometimes being in the kitchen and knowing how these funds are actually allocated. And I will do it in the context of not necessarily the multilateral institutions, but in the context of how asset owners, who are the real owners of the capital in this world, actually make decisions with respect to their assets. For the longest time in the last 60 years, since we can call it the evolution of global finance with the introduction of modern portfolio theory, for which Harry Markowitz, Merton Miller, and William Sharpe were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1990, there has been a prevailing logic in the manner in which asset owners have allocated their assets. First, assets are allocated in asset classes according to a mathematical model that trades off risk and return. This process has been mainly executed within the asset owners themselves, but a lot of times, as Joe very well mentioned, with the help of financial institutions, typically asset managers, that later on decide or manage those assets. Once the allocation has been decided in each asset class, asset owners allocate their assets to asset managers, who in turn hire portfolio managers to create financial products that would attract those mandates and who would again trade off risk and return. This asset allocation process, as it has been mentioned repeatedly today, has an inherent bias towards asset classes in developed countries, since this is the way in which most global indices are built, obviously hurting investments in developing economies. But what may be even worse, because of the inherent pro-cyclical bias towards flight to quality or flight to safety, these models have generated liquidity crises in developing economies in the face of global emergencies, especially when those occur in developed countries. Funds are channeled to developed economies in good times, when they may be needed the least, and removed from those economies in bad times, when they're needed the most. Global financial institutions like the IMF or the World Bank have been ineffective during these crises to compensate for this negative flow of capital. We must do something to break this negative cycle, and that is through the introductions of variations of those asset allocation models that we can achieve some results. One of the ideas is to add a new term that has to do with development and not just consider risk and return. Because if we can consider this additional term, then the asset allocation can be done differently. But to go back to the topic of this session, let me now focus on the second problem, and that has to do with how assets are allocated within a particular asset class. We have witnessed some rays of hope when it comes to this challenge, and that has to do with the creation of financial products which not only pursue the logic of trade-off between risk and return, but also incorporate other criteria like ESG, SDGs, or the broader notion of impact investing. There has been some measurable success, particularly with the issue of climate, and particularly in Europe, with the creation of a variety of financial products which promote investments in climate-aware assets. Unfortunately, while we all thought that this would be a trend that would not only continue but also gain significant momentum, we have seen uneven progress as well as significant backward steps in some geographies like the US. I am, having been in the private sector for quite some time, a firm believer that a strong collaboration between the public and the private sector can help us make significant progress in this domain. While the political mood may not be helpful, it is the conviction of asset owners which is needed to regain momentum. It is the role of regulators and other government institutions to continue the promotion of this virtuous cycle in which those investable products are created. Now, let me finish by saying the following. It is quite ironic that last year, when I was here, I proposed a potential radical solution in the case of the friendly lobbying of asset owners or the pressure from governments to the financial industry to achieve some results. In that intervention, I suggested that we should reconsider the tax-free status of certain non-for-profits if they would not adopt sustainable investment policies. Earlier this year, the US president proposed to remove the tax-free status of Harvard exactly for the opposite reason, just because they're promoting policies that are related to equality and inclusion. While there's nothing to be proud with respect to the concrete actions taken by G1, maybe there's something to learn from the political audacity of that proposal. The emergency which we face in terms of sustainability and climate change as a whole requires bold measures that we should be willing to adopt in the context of a progressive agenda. We should not be shy or too timid as we push for change. The need to intervene in this emergency of climate requires us to be bold and to act decisively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. So now we'll go to Frederick.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I would like to focus on unlocking investment opportunities in emerging markets and start with an IFC initiative and then explore ways to expand it into agriculture. So first, the use by IFC of its balance sheet to unlock investment capabilities. There's a very well-known suboptimal situation in the global financial landscape. On the one hand, emerging markets face an urgent need for green infrastructure investments. On the other hand, there are massive pools of capital in developed countries seeking for long-term investments. We wrote a paper with Joe, Patrick, from global savings cloud to financing infrastructures. Fine. Among the various reasons for this imbalance, two stands out. The first one is a lack of appetite for emerging market debt among investors in developed markets. It's often due to regulatory constraints or outdated risk assessment frameworks. Just recently, if you were asking GPIF, the largest pension fund on earth, how much do you invest into emerging market debt? The answer would be zero. And then the second reason is limited expertise in infrastructure investing, with the notable exception of Canadian and Australian pension funds, which have developed strong capabilities in this area. But globally, investors don't know how to invest in infrastructures locally. And then makes little sense to expect them to do so abroad. So we have two major issues. To address this gap, the IFC implemented an innovative approach. Without being too technical, IFC created a structured fund composed of a junior tranche and a senior tranche. And then this risk-sharing mechanism improved the credit rating of the senior tranche from BB+ to A+, making it much more attractive to conservative investors. Problem number one solved. But we still have the problem number two, the lack of know-how on how to invest into infrastructures. And here, the IFC had a moment of genius. They said, let's have the fund make investments in green bonds issued by local banks. By investing in green bonds issued by domestic banks, investors gained exposure to the diversified and familiar risk profiles of bank balance sheets, while the banks, by issuing the green bonds, directed the funds toward green infrastructures projects. So concretely, it was a way to decouple the risks taken by the investors from the flow of money. And then the problem number two was solved. And so through a single fund, IFC was able to launch a vehicle that is deploying $2 billion, and interestingly as well, attracting many first-time investors in emerging markets, including major European institutions such as pension funds and insurance companies in Sweden. So two things combined, helping unlock the investment capabilities of these pension funds or insurance companies. Now, not to be too long, agriculture. We all know that one of the major global challenges is ensuring sustainable agriculture. While many farmers are already contributing to this goal, accessing carbon markets to monetize their environmental efforts remains complex and out of reach for most of them. A potential solution could involve local banks acting as intermediaries. These banks could link loans conditions to the adoption of sustainable agriculture practices. By doing so, they will not only support the transition to sustainable farming, but also reduce the credit risk associated with their lending portfolios. And icing on the cake, once these practices are implemented and verified, the banks could claim carbon credits on behalf of the farmers and then issue green bonds, allowing them to tap into new pools of environmental-focused investors. To conclude, not to be long, what do all these two examples have in common? Yes, we need better regulation, but we also need a financial system that fulfills its role in allocating resources for the benefit of society. And that, in turn, requires financial innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite interesting how this session, we see much more connections between finance and real economy and the real things that are happening in the economy. So thank you very much for all those introductory comments. So now I will start with Dauda. Yeah. Okay. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so thank you. I wanted to touch upon the issue of debt conversions and debt swaps that President Osinbajo talks about. Definitely, this is one of those actions that needs to be taken to hopefully help address the current debt crisis. And definitely, this is something that was mentioned in the report. And there is a lot of momentum right now on this issue, including actually as part of the FFT process. We've seen actually the Spanish government very much taking an initiative on this issue. Maybe what I wanted to mention is just a couple of things. First of all, on the report, definitely we advocated for debt for nature swap. I have to say that maybe could have been expanded to not only debt for nature swap, but also to debt for climate swaps, and even debt for development swaps. Those are actually some sort of instrument that might be actually playing the same role, not only to help resolve the debt crisis, but also at the same time free more resources for climate and nature, at the same time also create more fiscal space for government. So that's very much important. Another thing that I wanted also to add is I think we definitely were correct in pushing and insisting, underscoring the need for debt swaps to be created in a careful manner, in a transparent manner, but also equitably. And definitely that is very much important. And I think one thing that we learn from experience is debt swaps have sometimes been extremely complex, and that complexity needs to be addressed. But I think one of the key issues also is if we want to scale up the use of debt swap, and I think that's what everyone wants, a critical shortcoming of the current system is the lack of credit enhancement resources and credit enhancement tool, particularly from the region where we are from. And there is, to date, not enough actually credits, so a debt for nature or debt for climate swap in Africa. We've seen, of course, a couple of them. I'm talking about the commercial one from Seychelles and also from Gabon more recently. But the problem is actually we don't have a local or a Pan-African financial institution so far that has been actually providing those type of credit enhancement. When actually Gabon did it, it was DFC from the US that provided that. So we need to really advocate for more of this. And I think there is some work that is ongoing by some MDBs, including, of course, IADB, even actually the African Development Bank. That work has to be encouraged. That work has to be, of course, pushed and hopefully also influenced and to very much actually achieve that type of result that we're talking about. And if you allow me, Chair, just shortly, since Martin didn't give me the floor on the SDR, so I wanted to add something there, because I think one thing that we all agree is SDRs are very much needed, whether we are talking about new SDR issuances or whether we are talking about SDR rechanneling. Unfortunately, right now is not the political environment to push for that, but who knows, because what I heard is, okay, maybe there could be some rooms there. If we have to push, we need to push. But what I wanted to add there also is there is one element of the SDR that we don't talk about enough. Although, of course, SDR will free and actually allocate more resources to countries, particularly developing countries. Vera was right that when it was issued back in 2021, Africa got more than $30 billion. That was extremely helpful, not only to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, but also for other purposes. One thing that we need also to keep in mind is SDR also sometimes also is costly. Why? Because as you all know, SDR, the IMF apply an interest rate, an SDR interest rate on the net holding of SDR, which means that if you actually hold, or if you use more SDR compared to what you were allocated by the IMF, you pay an interest rate, the SDR interest rate on that sort of net holding, which is negative for many African countries and for many developing countries. By contrast, if you actually have a positive net holding, like it is the case for all advanced economies, you earn interest. So for those countries, like in Africa, that are actually forced to pay interest rates on SDR, that's a big issue. We don't talk about it enough. Of course, it's nothing compared to the original sort of allocation, but this is something that is costly and that actually keep compounding as you sort of borrow more from the IMF and as you get also SDR, or, proceed from the SDR allocation. So what it means is 4 years ago when the SDR were allocated, the SDR interest rate was 0. No one cared. No one thought about it. Now it is almost 5%. Why? Because actually the SDRs are determined by the IMF on a weekly basis on the interest rate on currency. That's actually are part of the basket currency, the 5 currencies. So right now, because those interest rates are high, the SDR rate is high. This is something that we need to keep in mind. It's going to be something that needs to be part of the reform of the SDR system if ever we get the political momentum to do it. Thank you, and sorry for over-talking.
Okay, so now we have few names, I think there were a few other hands, but Martin's helping me organize this. Michael first, Jacobs, then Keith Lockwood, then Marcus Miller, and then Mahmoud, and then Marilu. Okay, and then we'll take another round. Okay, so please, first, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sister Alford, and for those very helpful contributions. I speak as the advisor to the expert review on debt, nature, and climate, which I mentioned before, which in many ways is a complementary report to the present one. One of the things that I think we haven't really acknowledged sufficiently in the discussion so far, and in the title of this, is that we don't have just a climate crisis, we have a nature crisis. They are very closely related to one another, but they have separate elements to it. There are aspects of biodiversity loss, of ocean biodiversity loss and pollution, and other aspects of the nature crisis, which are not simply aspects of the climate crisis. And these, the effects of these are occurring now in the same way that climate impacts are being felt now, and they are going to accelerate. And unlike on climate, where in some respects we have begun the process of taking action, the indicators are all downwards in nature. Those of you who followed the recent Oceans Conference would have seen the new evidence that has emerged about the degradation of the oceans, complete loss of insect life around the world, which is causing huge problems in agriculture because of loss of pollination, leading to the decline of other species. So please let us handle these things together. There are a climate and nature crisis. They are intertwined, but we need both. And the expert review on debt, nature, and climate tried to do that. We had a number of recommendations. I want to pick out 2, which I think are worth adding to this. So one was green debt relief, by which we meant for different kinds of countries that are both in insolvency problems, real debt restructuring needed, but also those that we have liquidity problems, which you want to address in advance of their deeper problems. The possibility that green restructuring and debt restructuring and refinancing could include, I'm not going to call it green conditionality, but green commitments, that is effectively investments in nature and climate restoration, resilience, by the countries to get an additional form of debt relief. This would be justified under a debt sustainability analysis, which properly included climate and nature. Those investments ought to fall out of a proper DSA, and one of our recommendations is to do that. That might also speak not only to the countries, as Yemi Osinbajo says, that want to pursue climate and nature positive growth, but also to creditor countries, not just the Western ones, but China as well, who have an interest in the global public good of climate and nature resilience. The second proposal was for some new financing instruments. We do need debt relief, but we also need some good green lending, borrowing. We know that ODA is declining. There is limited capacity in the public sector in creditor countries. So one of our proposals is to use effectively advance aid commitments. We haven't lost all aid. There will be some aid, but to use advanced aid commitments to enable the private sector effectively to securitize future aid flows. We obviously did this for vaccinations, the IFM scheme, led by my old boss, Gordon Brown, originally, to effectively have promises of future aid, not all aid, but that aid which we are committed to be securitized to provide climate financing and nature financing now. The need is now. And secondly, to use the benefits of adaptation investment to pay for the savings from adaptation investments to pay for those investments, which we think the insurance industry, which pays out when there are disasters, might be interested in. We go into these in more detail. So some other ideas to put on the table alongside better DSA and better use of existing instruments, including swaps. Swaps are very important. They should be standardized, but they are relatively small scale. They are good financing instruments for specific purposes, but they don't address fundamental debt problems, and for that we need some new financing and a better DSA to analyze it. Thank you.
I was pleased that Leonardo spoke about how to reduce the transaction costs of debt swaps, because they are advocated as an instrument that we can use in a constrained financing environment. Last year we did some research, and if you took the prevailing kind of transaction costs of debt swaps and applied that to existing developing countries, only about 8% of developing countries could use debt swaps in a financially efficient way. If you could reduce those transaction costs to 150 basis points compared to the 250 prevailing costs, then you literally doubled the number of countries that could access debt swaps and use them in an efficient way. But I think it's also worth pointing out that as we've talked about asymmetries in the global financing environment, there are also asymmetries in capacities of developing countries. And debt swaps have become very sophisticated and complex, and the capacity of countries to do this, especially since many of them haven't done it before, or some of them only did it 15 or 20 years ago, is very limited. So while we're thinking about these things, we also need to think about how you enhance the capacity to utilize these instruments. And we have considered platform arrangements and things that would enable countries to learn from the experiences of other countries and to try and reduce those transaction costs in the process so that they can become a more usable and efficient instrument of finance. Thanks.
In my comment, I would like to make a connection between the previous session and this session. Alfonso Apicelli and others have asked how to motivate the formal analysis in the report, and in particular, how to persuade those in richer countries that they should actually get involved. It's obvious why those in the poorer countries should welcome the report, but why should those in richer countries? Well, a key part of the answer is, of course, the presence of externalities. And global warming, the topic of this session, is an obvious example. Many poor countries are suffering from the effects of previous industrialization of the currently rich creditor countries. But this is generating another externality, an externality that hasn't been mentioned yet, but is political dynamite in many richer countries, namely economic migration. The attempt by economic migrants to escape the adverse consequences we've heard of in the global south by moving to the global north. By not tackling these linked externalities, we are all living in a world of second best. We live in a world of multiple equilibrium, as Joe Stiglitz pointed out, and we've chosen a bad equilibrium. The report is trying to show us how to move to a better equilibrium, but it does require coordination, and these are the topics that are explored in the report. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and again, excellent interventions, and I won't have time to comment on the 4 excellent interventions, but I'll pick 2. I'll start with what His Excellency Mr. Osenbago shared with us on the opportunities for Africa. And again, this is basically the kind of African answer to what Professor Stiglitz and Sister Helen and others mentioned about this issue of the ecological debt or the moral debt. There is a message that you would hear for every COP, those who are attending COPs. If you are listening to African heads of state and heads of government, you say, well, responsibility for Africa and the total emission is between 3 to 3.5% of total emissions. This is not a reason for celebration, as mentioned by the Vice President. Basically, it's a reason for condemning the kind of circumstance that pushing us into this. If it is a fair world with the current technologies, the emissions should be at least 20%. If we take the population of Africa, compare that to the rest of the world. And there is an issue as well of hypocrisy. I live in Bethesda, and when I was preparing for the COP, until recently, that stopped with the new administration. So there was a kind of an advert that you will not miss in YouTube's. Celebrate the move to greener technology. And the greener technology in Bethesda, which is near Washington, D.C., is saying, well, we are converting and transiting to natural gas. This is something that Africans were denied access to as one of the forms of fossil fuel that should be stopped. They don't have access to nuclear. They don't have access to solar, wind as well, and the technologies are a bit expensive and you cannot really get funds for that, or using the just energy transition approach to deal with these matters. So, well, there could be one thing that came from drill, baby drill kind of arguments that could complicate matters, but that could push us in the scenario that the Vice President had warned us against. So there are many solutions based on 3: behavioral change, technology, access to technology, and then finance would follow. My worry is, and this is the second point, that ODA is being revised. And now there are arguments that ODA needs to be a new form of investment. My worry is that it could have the same fate. Those who have been around in the 90s, they may, in the discussions, they may have followed the from aid to trade kind of argument. And we ended up from aid to no trade. So now it could be from aid to investment, and we'll have the same kind of a problem. Meanwhile, we have a great deal of opportunity, including better use of extractives. My good professors at Warwick University, Alan Rowe, and his colleague Edison, produced 2 volumes on the better use of extractives, including critical raw material. Vera published something as well that using them better for investment and bargaining the trade deals. That would be a good opportunity by being part of the value addition. That could really provide some answers to how the real economy could be linked better to the investment opportunities. And the very final thing, I'm happy that in 3 proposals of the 11 proposals of the work that Trevor and I and Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni and Professor Wang have been doing, there are 3 places you'll find debt swaps very clear there. From capacity building to lower transaction costs, not just for climate or nature, but for development, especially that the IMF in recent staff papers have been blessing the use of debt swaps for development. linking them to the macro framework, and abandon the piecemeal approach. But we're going further to lower the transaction cost on that. The other thing is basic about international coordination between the different bodies, but we need really to provide these solutions when needed, as mentioned by Keith, when there is an issue of need for third-party support to lower the risk of the transaction costs. One very final thing is basically, again, back to the original sin. It's basically issues related to the pipeline of bankable, investable projects. There are many opportunities in infrastructure, many opportunities in energy that could really be conducted by decent, well-articulated private-public or public-private partnerships. And we can really do a better job with whatever remains of concessional finance for the harder areas to reach by the private sector, including human capital. This common sense approach is being very much missing in many countries and very much responsible as well of origination of unnecessary debt accumulated by state-led kind of intervention, perhaps with good intentions, but with higher costs of obtaining capital and at a cost of abandoning better opportunities for public investment. And again, this is one of the proposals of the 11 proposals that we put forward in this document that I hope is going to be released soon. But let's celebrate first, give time to the Jubilee report, and then a couple of days after, we will say, well, we have some practical answers to operationalize many of the excellent recommendations coming from the Jubilee report. Thank you.
Okay, please, okay.
No, I've been stimulated by the intervention by Marcus Miller. You talked about externalities. It seems to me there is much more than that. The point is, the problem we are talking about today is a typical problem of traverse analysis. We know that the old equilibrium is not working any longer, and we want to move to the new equilibrium. But what is the typical mistakes of economists? Reasoning in terms of comparative statics. But that is not true, because to move from the old to the new equilibrium takes time. And so we have to face a traverse cost. Now, as we know, if it happens that during the traverse, the cost of transitions are very high, it might be impossible to reach the new equilibrium, even though we can prove that the new equilibrium is Pareto superior to the previous one. I wonder whether in the report, at least a mention can be done. It would be very important to make a simulation just to tentatively to evaluate the transition cost, but with specific reference to at least to certain countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister. It's a privilege to be part of this effort in the Jubilee year and appreciate the rich discussion today. I just have a brief remark, which is to draw attention to the importance of the forward-looking proposal on the creation of the Global Climate Fund for better financing risk sharing, which was mentioned in the previous session. So the climate disasters, both rapid and slow onset, have major impact on growth and development, and that negative impact persists over many years until the country recovers growth, if they do at all. So yet there's insufficient focus on, to date, on what to do and where the financing could come from, including in the IFIs, on the systematic mechanisms to support countries when climate events happen, and how to deal with climate vulnerability and build resilience. And even if the IFIs or MDBs can do more, they may not necessarily be the full or best solution, even with cheaper lending to supporting development countries deal with climate risks. So from the country perspective, climate vulnerable countries have repeatedly expressed concern that they borrow to be able to respond with very expensive terms for lack of better options, which may not be the best financing approach to build resilience and deal with lack of resilience. So at the same time, there's strong evidence, despite efforts, that developing countries underinvest, heavily underinvest actually, in adaptation relative to needs that could ameliorate the consequences of climate events. And that's strongly recognized in the COP process with no real financing solutions or risk sharing in sight. So while a new fund will probably generate major resistance from major countries who might be expected to contribute, or even that there are multiplicity of climate funds, underfunded climate funds, there's still a good reason for greater advocacy for such risk-sharing instrument and better financing instrument, which could yield benefits and increase awareness for more systematic and more appropriate financing to foster resilience, strengthen growth prospects, but also deal with climate justice. So now the needs are great, and I think one more fund, a discussion of really appropriate means of funding resilience would be an important contribution to climate and debt. Thank you.
Okay, so Martin's told me that Kevin wanted to speak. Anybody else put their hand up before and I didn't see would like to make a comment? Okay, great. We'll go to Kevin.
Thanks so much. A great session. There's something in the report that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it really links the climate and debt, and that's the discussion that we have on DSA. There's something that's just a sentence or two that says that DSAs focus too much just on the financial stability as an end in of itself, rather than being able to mobilize the kinds of investment you need in a financially sound and fiscally responsible manner, which is a very different way to think about the tool. And a lot of us have been engaging with the IMF over the past 6 to 8 months on improving the DSA, and some of us have done some alternative DSAs and showed that a lot of this can be done. And they were making some incremental changes with a lot of resistance. So some of it was political from above, and some of it was just their economics. But in the new regime, the kinds of things that they were moving forward on, they're going to move backward on. They're not going to be incorporating, at least doing scenarios of the potential of a climate shock and how that might affect you. They're not going to help you identify at least a scenario of what your debt sustainability would be if you incorporated the spending needs of the Songwei-Stern report. Those are the kinds of things that are just not going to be on the table now. And so that's the bad news. But the good news is, I guess echoing what Mary Lou said, is that why should there be one institution and one tool? And there's already a lot of effort around. I know that FDL works with the Council on Finance Ministers for Climate Action. They've had workshops on how those finance ministries can do their own DSAs, and we work with a group called the V20, and we've been training them on how to do their own DSAs. And just like with academics, when we look at the same research question and have two different methodologies to get there and we debate it, why can't the Ministry of Finance in Ghana have its rigorous DSA and have a Trump-stamped IMF one, and they'll have to bargain and negotiate it? That'll be highly beneficial in the Article 4 context, because those are negotiated. And the best countries do that. You know, Brazil negotiates their Article 4, Japan famously. You know, all these things are contested, and then the final version. It will slow down the actual restructuring process, obviously, if you've got 3 or 4 of these things. But as an economist, I believe in competition, and I think we've focused so much on trying to get the fund to improve their methodology, and we saw what they could do, the tiny stuff they did with the MAC DSA, which the guy over there who's moved from economy to business class is the best critic of how bad the MAC DSA, it got worse. And at best, that's what the LIC DSA will look like. And so unfortunately, and I say this as a citizen of the U.S., is like we're in a Kindleberger trap when it comes to the international financial institutions. And so rather than putting our efforts in trying to have them get their economics right, let's work with like-minded countries and create competition with this analytical tool and use DSAs to figure out how countries can mobilize the finance for productive investment in a way that's fiscally sound and financially stable, rather than using them as a way, just as financial stability as an ends, which implicitly rigs the entire analytical framework into austerity under the conditions that people have talked about.
Thank you, Kevin. Gustavo.
Thank you, Sister Helen. I would like to introduce an inconvenient reality: the cryptocurrencies. the digital currencies. Should we consider in some aspects of this proposal and report this reality? In the case of Argentina, I would share with you a very specific example. Two of the main companies in the real economy are in the process of being bought by a stable coin company. And they are placed in two very strategic sectors. Agrobusiness, one of the most important companies of the country, and biotechnology. So the central banks are considering the digital currency too. The European Union has provided a clear framework through MiCA in order to regulate the cryptocurrencies, and they are a reality in our financial sector. How to address this very complicated and little orthodox reality is a very important issue in my opinion.
Okay, so I think we are coming to a conclusion on this section. Thank you very much for everybody's contribution, and we now can move to our last session. So I don't know if we want to, shall I hand over to you, Martin? Thank you.
All right, so there's no coffee break between session 4 and the discussion of the next steps. So we're going to close this meeting with a few final remarks first from Cardinal Peter Turkson, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, then from Sister Helen Alford, the President, then Joe Stiglitz will offer his final conclusions, and I will conclude. First, Cardinal Peter Turkson, your guidance also on the role that the Church and your thoughts on the role that the Church can have to continue supporting the creation of a solution for the current debt crisis, and also, as the report says, the creation of the financial foundations for a sustainable people-centered global economy.
Yeah. Thank you for your indulgence. I would just like to speak momentarily about next steps with a comparison of then and now. When I say then, I won't actually go to the Torah and the Christian scriptures to actually talk about the continuing process that was established every 7 times 7 years to protect all of us from becoming too rich or too poor. But the then and now is the Jubilee 2000 moment and the Jubilee 2025 moment, and how we work together to translate this very important information to the pews with both the promises and the challenges, the distinct differences between Jubilee 2000 and Jubilee 2025. In Jubilee 2000, it was really a 7-year campaign that began in 1998 and culminated in the Glen Eagles Summit of 2005. And it's important to note the massive mobilization that built up over 7 years, led by the Church and other religious bodies. That massive and powerful mobilization, which would lead to 30 million petitions being delivered to the G8 Cologne Summit in 2004, and His Holiness Pope Benedict making the final chess move at the Glen Eagles Summit in 2005 on debt relief. It's important to look at the distinctions. The big distinction, which this report does so well and why it's so needed, is the creditor landscape is very different than in the early 2000s. And because of that massive debt relief we won, our asks and our targets were much, much narrower than what they need to be now for these coming years of campaigns. So while there was lots of consensus building at the United Nations, at other global decision-making fora, the G8 made the decisions. So the petitions were directed at the G8, and the petition had 3 asks: debt relief, responsible lending and borrowing, and building a new process akin to international bankruptcy. Very focused, one place. Everyone in the world were able to focus this growing movement by delivering 30 million petitions in 2004. Now, the promise and the challenge, the opportunity, and the concern is now we are talking about a dozen different targets. And so, certainly a next step for the report is operationalizing where all of these decisions are going to be made. So the promise about those different targets is actually all over the world, those targets are much closer to home. So it allows us to do closer mobilization to our governments and our capitals. So where the G8 was the focus in the early movement, right now we have the G7 we need to act, the G20 needs to act, the IMF and World Bank needs to act, the New York legislature needs to act, the UK Parliament needs to act, certain UN fora need to act. So it means that we have the ability to kind of spread out, but if we're really talking about the changes that we all agree are needed, that this important report lifts up, we are dealing with a larger array of actors. We're dealing with a very different creditor landscape. And with this report, in terms of what it does in addressing the current debt and development crisis, 1, number 2, dealing with stopping future crises, and number 3, the economic policies that are needed to address poverty and heal our planet, that package requires a lot more decision makers involved. So I just wanted to add, as we're thinking about next steps, knowing that it took us 7 years in 2005 to culminate for the victories of the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, we are looking at a moment where the creditor landscape is different, the targets are more broad, and over the next few years, we need to move forward these policies among multiple decision-making fora, not just one.
I see people keep raising their hands. We've been discussing budget constraints, right? So we also have time constraints. And I also want to allow a little bit of time, at least for media engagement. We have the presence of media here, and I want to give them the chance to talk to the commissioner. So I may be a little bit tough here and not give the floor to everyone. If you think it's indispensable, I see Michael thinks it, so go ahead, but...
The reason I think that Eric and I have not consulted, wanted to talk it, this was part of the program, and as I said to you at the beginning, Martin, I think we needed longer, not less time for the next steps because it's so critical. So Eric is absolutely right that there are multiple decision makers. But the other thing we've learned in 20 years of campaigning, not just on debt and development, but climate, is that you need single moments when the pressure comes to a point. And there's always a risk with the single moment that you set in advance because you hype it up to be the point at which decisions have to be made. And if they're not made, you get excess failure. We can name Copenhagen as a good example of that. But if you do hype it up and you really apply pressure at one moment, on all countries and all institutions, you get the Paris Climate Agreement. And which was much more ambitious than any of us thought it could be, and where that process of applying pressure, and the pressure was applied inside and outside. It was an inside-outsider strategy. You need governments that want to do it, and then you need the pressure from civil society that pushes them onto the right place. So my suggestion is, and we have here not just this wonderful report, but we have the expert review on debt, nature, and climate. We have Mahmoud's, I'm very glad to hear it will be a report. We have the African expert panel. We also have another group which hasn't been mentioned here, but which is critical to this, which is the Bretton Woods at 80 initiative that Mark Malloch-Brown, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, and Patrick Ache are co-chairing, which will also produce something later this year, very much around the same issues. So we have the data, we have the evidence. We now need to build a campaign. It will have multiple points, but I do think we need a moment. And let me just offer this as the last 2005, we haven't got 7 years to do it. 7 years is too long this time. The last moment of that kind here was done under the UK presidency of the G8, when Gordon Brown, who I used to advise, did it. The UK will be presidency either of the G7 or of the G20 in 2 years' time. It's not quite clear. The UK government has reneged on its development commitments, but it is under massive pressure internally within the Labour Party from civil society around that, which is just the opportunity you want for a government to do something. So I wonder whether we shouldn't be thinking of this as a 2-year process at which we bring these things together and we say this is the moment at which these reports, the Pope's call, has to come to action.
All right, so Charles Abugre, your country, Ghana, is suffering a debt crisis. So by nationality, you earn the right to have the last word before the concluding comments.
And I think it is appropriate because I wanted to address my suggestion to the Pontifical Council and to the Vatican. I think we were successful with the HIPIC campaign because we linked debt, trade, and others to the suffering of the poorest. And it's this relationship to poverty that actually created the change. And I think if there is one set of actors that the Vatican leading could make a change, because it's the most difficult set of actors, are bondholders. This is because the poorest, the countries under debt distress, including mine, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Ethiopia, a lot of them coming up, Laos on the background coming along, are also very, very poor countries. And they have very little experience dealing with private sector debt restructuring. They had many years of experience with the Paris Club and others. So my suggestion would be, if possible, that the Vatican leads and the Pontifical Council leads a project of engaging the chief executive officers of the known major bondholders in a dialogue for a one-off haircut in the countries currently suffering the highest levels of debt distress.
Thank you very much. So now, then we move to the concluding remarks. We have some final thoughts, reflections, or advice, whatever you choose. First from Cardinal Turkson, if you want to add something.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Two small things. In the first place, I just wanted to observe that the debt crisis in poor or emerging countries are not always, based on borrowing or do not always derive from borrowing. Some of them do derive from investment. Several developing countries are encouraged to be investment friendly. And in their investment friendliness, sometimes get into investment deals that takes them to investment courts, where they always lose. And in losing in investment courts, they also incur debt, having to settle with the investors. So that's one other source of poverty or indebtedness of some of these countries. Finally, I just wanted to observe that the message we got from Secretary of State appreciates the fact that this group is created this framework, for which it commends you very highly. Then he goes on to also call for as for the proposal of other measures to fraternal solidarity, etc., and so on. In the light of that, I'd like to probably tag on to the observation of the Jubilee. In fact, this Jubilee is preceded by two other Jubilees in the past. 2000 by Pope John Paul II, and then 2015 by Pope Francis with a call to mercy, mercifulness and all. And from these two Jubilees, one can formulate something that can be proposed also as measures for the call that we're trying to make about debt forgiveness or condoning debt or whatever. Already this morning, the observation was made that holding this meeting here in the Vatican is special because not just economics, but also reference to morality, faith positions, and all. So that's why I make these observations. In 2000, when Pope John Paul II called for the Jubilee, he invited us to a creative form of charity to be able to support and push for the call for debt cancellation. He referred to that as a creative form of charity. Not simply ordinary charity, but a charity which has a new creative form. And this, his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, would say that this is a call to all in society, to this exercise of creative form of charity. So this creative form of charity proposed by Pope John Paul II is expanded and made more far-reaching by Pope Francis, who in his 2015 Jubilee rooted everything in mercifulness, inviting us to imitate the mercifulness of God, saying that in imitating the mercifulness of God, we're able to make things inclusive, not leaving anybody outside, but helping bring everybody on board. So I like to put the two together, the invitation to be creative or to exercise creative forms of charity, this as something that can be offered to creditors, and again, the appeal to mercifulness as a way of also bringing everybody on board, including everybody in this program of development, not excluding anybody. Recalling that when in 2015, Ban Ki-moon introduced the SDGs at the United Nations, his concluding statement was that this is a human dignity narrative that leaves nobody behind, or that leaves nobody out. So based on that, I think the call to a system that fashions inclusiveness and access to development and growth is something that needs to be appreciated. So in response to the message that we just received calling for other measures to encourage us in solidarity and fraternity, I just like to refer to these two from the two Jubilees of the past. A call to be creative in our forms of exercise of charity, and a call to undergird everything we do with the mercifulness, almost the mercifulness of God. Thank you.
So I'd like to start with this quote from the report that I mentioned in my comments at the beginning, where I said that the report looks to an ongoing future for the Commission and to make a contribution to comprehensive rethinking. So I think in some sense we need to think about broadening a bit what we're doing so that we see the debt issue in a bigger context and the deeper underlying issues which some people already mentioned today come more into the picture. I like the idea of a 2-year thing, but I also think what Joe is talking about is a longer term thing. So I think we need to think about both. We need to find some kind of milestones. I'm also thinking we have a Jubilee in 2033, the Jubilee of the Redemption. It will be another big Jubilee. If we think about redemption, debt reduction, two things go very closely together. So it's a bit too far away in some ways, but I think this is an ongoing process. So I think the 2-year milestone is a good thing. we need to find a good way, I think, as an academy of maintaining connection with the civil society actors who are here, with the campaigning. We need to find a good way of doing it. I'm saying that because we realize that we are mostly focused on the academic issues. So we need to be able to link well with what you're doing, find a good relationship with what you're doing. And I want to encourage you to help us do it. You know, Joe was saying we need a glossary of terms, that sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that we probably need to work on together, you know, something like I also wonder whether we need to get some big issue, like, should we really start thinking about the International Bankruptcy Court? Should this be a sort of real kind of umbrella that we should be trying? We didn't talk about it so much today because we're talking about more kind of achievable objectives, but should it be a sort of a framing, or should it be mission-driven? You know, that's connecting us more to the real economy, the kind of thing that Mariana Mazzucato was doing. I wonder whether we need something like this that holds together this broader vision with the key issues about debt that we've been talking about on development today. And I think also we have to try to get some kind of document from Pope Leo. We have to work out the way to do it. I think it was very important what some people said about Laudato Si, about the transformational effect that Laudato Si had. We need some kind of parallel document connected with these issues. So we will be thinking about how to do this. Thank you.
Well, I just want to reflect, reiterate what has already been said, and thank you all for coming and for your active engagement all day, and for those who were the commissioners, for your active engagement over the last several months. I want to first focus just for a minute on the debt issue that we centered our attention on. And obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be done on the advocacy side and working with the advocacy groups. This is an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's also something where we want to make real changes. And so we look forward to working with all of you on that issue of advocacy and realizing how hard it is. In some ways, we did the easy part. You really have the hard part on this. I also, though, want to reflect on two other points. One, even though this subject has been discussed for a very long time, I thought we were able to make some intellectual contributions to our understanding of what was going on. And I think even in the course of the discussion today, in the course of what came into the comments on the previous version, we weren't able to incorporate them. I think there's a lot of new ideas that I mentioned, for instance, in the reform of the global architecture, new institutions, new contracts, that I think there's a lot of fodder for us to continue really active research and interaction, both in theory and the data. Partly the world is always changing, so even if we had solved it 25 years ago, we have a new world that we have to look at. I know it in some ways there's some pessimism about the particular moment, that it's a hard environment to discuss these issues when the world seems to be falling apart, democracy's falling apart. We thought we had an open trade regime. We were criticizing it because it wasn't quite perfect. And now we have, things have gone all the other way. So it is a difficult environment. But I think I also want to make note of the fact that there are new understandings about how the system works. I think we've made advances since over the last 20 years. We understand why some of the previously widely held views were not quite correct, both empirically and theoretically. I think we made advances that enable us to make further advances in addressing the debt problem. And we also have new tools that have partly come out of this. I mean, I think the acceptance of SDRs is an important tool. I mean, you know, I remember giving a talk in Stockholm on the issue of global currencies in the year 2001. At the time I got the Nobel Prize, it was one of the topics I was advocating in a civil society role in Stockholm. And there was interest, but not that much. I mean, it was sort of a, you know, now the discussion today has illustrated that a lot of people are engaged in it, a lot of thinking about how to institutionally do it. And I think it is an important tool, you know, in one way or another. But there are a lot of other tools, as I say, new contracts and so forth. So I think it gives me a little bit of optimism that in spite of the difficult environment, we may be able to make progress. And finally, I want to echo what actually we talked about with Pope Francis and was highlighted in Cardinal Turkson's remarks and in the letter that was read. I think there is a need to broaden the agenda. Part of the broadening of the agenda is on the debt issue itself, make sure that the debt doesn't recur, that we solve the problem, that we make these debt crises less frequent, less deep, less consequential. That should be part of our commitment going forward. But debt is part of finance, and finance is part of development. And if our commitment really in the end is raising the well-being, the lives of the people everywhere in the world, then I think we really have to broaden that agenda to focus on all the ingredients that go into successful development. But as an international academy, as an academy that brings people together from all over the world, I think there's a particular need to focus on, you might say, the global architecture. And there are at least three aspects of the global architecture that I think that we need to focus on, or four aspects. One is the global taxation architecture. We had a meeting on that. I think that's really important, of sharing, you know, providing, how do we share the burden of providing public goods around the world? And I'm very pleased the progress that has been made in thinking around this issue. Not in doing as much as in thinking, but it's moving in the right direction. The second is on investment. As the Chancellor pointed out, and one of our commissioners repeatedly emphasized, investment agreements have led to debt burdens that are very onerous. And the whole system is very unfair and actually linked to climate change, because it's tied the hands of many countries from changing the regulations that are needed for addressing climate change. And changing regulations that are related to health. When a country decides that they ought to have a regulation that you ought to let people know that smoking is bad for your health, they get sued by Philip Morris. And if they lose, they'll have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a need for a rethink on the investment, real investment architecture. There's a need for rethinking the global knowledge architecture. For me, that is important both for growth, but in a way for basic humanity. What we saw during the pandemic was abhorrent, where there was not a sharing of knowledge, that we should have celebrated the human achievement of very quickly discovering a vaccine against this pathogen. And yet we were not willing to share that knowledge. And the result of that was people died. People were hospitalized. And to me, it was really the moment where you realize the lack of global solidarity. You might say mercy or whatever, charity, whatever word you want. It was humanity. And I think we ought to be, in the Academy, be thinking about global knowledge framework. And finally, obviously, a global trade. That the previous architecture was inadequate. The one that the G1 wants to move us towards is worse. And that is an opportunity now for us realizing that the old one was rejected overnight, and yet the new one is worse, means that we really have an open door to begin to think about what would be a fair architecture that would promote development and well-being all over the world. So I hope these are some of the topics that we can explore in the coming years. And I'm not sure the mechanism, the timeline, but I hope we'll get together and figure out how do we do that with advocacy, because we are going to need change, and we won't be able to do it. We can formulate some of the ideas, but we'll need your help.
All right, so let me begin and finish with acknowledgements, and I'll say something in between. First, I want to thank the authorities of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences for all the work and the support to this project and the different projects over the last few years that have been pushed here from the Vatican that have been consequential. So thank you, Cardinal Peter Turkson, thank you, President Helen Alford, and also thank you, Monsignor Dario Vigano, who was tremendously helpful in getting this organized. And next, let me thank both the team, the two teams, the teams from the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and the team from Columbia University Initiative for Policy Dialogue. We wouldn't be able to do this without their work, which is absolutely essential. So let me name them, Alessandra and Gabriela from the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Gabriela is still here, so thank you so much, Gabriela, for everything you do. And Savannah, also Gabriela, but Gabriela Plum, who is not here now. And especially, Ximena, also thank you for your fantastic work, and especially to someone who is not here today, and I'm sure she would love to be here, Olamide David. I don't know if she's listening to us. She did a tremendous amount of work, high quality work. This is much more complicated, I was talking than organizing a big wedding. And Olamide did a tremendous work. So we're grateful to all of them as well, and they deserve an applause. So. And then to Talia for the terrific work you're doing for disseminating, communicating, and helping us to have the influence that we want to achieve in the report, and to all the people that are helping you on the communications front. To all the commissioners, I've been impressed, very positively impressed by the turnout and the quality of the responses, the commitment. So when I see this, I think there is hope. And that's so important because all of you are so busy with so many opportunities, and you devote your time with the vocation of public service to this. So I'm grateful for that. Some of you lead institutions, academic think tanks, and you have devoted the structure of those institutions. I see a few of you present here, like, for instance, the Boston University Global Development Center, the CEPR in Washington, D.C., the IIPP at the University of College London, different organizations that I could go on. Of course, the Finance Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics, and I have people behind me, probably I'm missing a few. Asset, of course, Asset, Mavis, thank you so much for everything. And to the civil society that is present here, your work is so important, as Joe said, and the foundations. This wouldn't be, your support is also absolutely critical for getting this done. So thank you for believing in what we are doing, and we hope you continue believing in what we want to do in the future. And to the journalists that are present here, also your work is super important and it's complementary to what we do. It wouldn't mean much what we do without the attention that we get from you and your commitment to this. To all the participants that are not commissioners as well, including Roberto Carles and Jeffrey Holt, thank you so much for all the support over the last few months. Your work has been so important. Let me then talk briefly about processes. Tomorrow morning, Professor Joe Stiglitz and the leaders of the other debt commissions are meeting with Cardinal Parolin at the Secretary of State, so with the Secretary of State of the Vatican, basically to plan how we can optimize the future engagement and the role that the Church can play in promoting for solutions in the developing countries that are suffering debt. And that's going to be also a very important milestone for the work of the Jubilee Commission and also the work of the other commissioners and for the work of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Then the Commission will be present in different fora, and we're trying to create even more spaces. We will present the report next week at the forum of the Paris Club. Then the report will be presented at the Financing for Development Conference in Seville over the weekend. And we expect to also be present at the G20 and at the IMF and World Bank annual meetings this year. And we're also going to be present at the Berlin Global Dialogue. Caroline Albrecht is the managing director of the Berlin Global Dialogue. At that meeting, we had many of the other side. Larry Fink has been a prominent speaker from BlackRock in the last two events. This is the kind of dialogue that will also help to reach the path that a solution requires. So the presence of the Jubilee Commission there is also very important. We hope to be able to engage more also with China, and we're working on that. And your ideas will be, you're all very knowledgeable people on these matters, and your ideas will be greatly appreciated. So please drop us an email over the next few days if you come up with alternative ideas. We will also continue doing work on the academic front that then once we are at a level that is sufficient to bring it here, we will come back, like for instance, special drawing rights. We plan to do a workshop at Columbia University on November 14th. We'll be in touch with you on that. But to conclude, let me finally thank two very special people. First, the chair of the commission, Professor Joe Stiglitz. Let me tell you a little bit about this. You work on a complete report, on a big draft, and there's a lot of back and forth, right? So day after day, there's communications. Joe may be traveling all over the world, Georgia, Catalonia, Asia, wherever he is. Then he sends you at 10:30 p.m. An email that says, enclosed with a few edits. Enclosed is the report, the draft of the report. A few edits mean 30% of the report has been changed, but it looks much better, more constructive, more thoughtful, and more intelligent. So then you work for a few hours until late and send it back to Joe, and at 7:30 a.m. in the morning, you want to have 7:30 a.m. in the morning, the day after, you already get the response from Joe with a few more edits. So, of course, Joe, the kind of commitment, motivation, and the brightness that you show is completely out of this planet, and we're so grateful that you give us all of that energy. And finally, I want to thank Pope Francis, who is now here with us, and of course I feel a bit emotional, but, sorry. So he was admitted to the hospital, sorry, 1 second. Can I have a bit of water? So Pope Francis was admitted to the hospital on February 12th. We were here, right here at this room. We were going to meet with him. He was totally on top of things, and I want to show you something. A day before he was admitted to the hospital, he sends me this letter for you. This is a letter for you. I never read it. He was feeling bad, and he said, I'm very happy for everything you are doing. I can't meet with you and Professor Stiglitz this time. I'm translating, right? Because I have a bronchitis that almost doesn't let me breathe. And this is in Spanish. Me restringen los encuentros, which is hard to translate, meaning like something like, they restrict me, the encounters, not the meetings, so it's the encounters. I pray for all of you. Please do it for me. Jesus bless you, and Virgin Mary protect you. Fraternally, Francisco. So he was so committed to this. And the Jubilee report is part of his legacy to the world, and I hope now we can continue the work with Pope Leo and make the best out of this. Thank you.
Exactly. That's just what I was going to say.